Imagine waking up in the dead of night to find your roommate's bed empty, but what if they never came back? In this case, a quiet suburban home became the stage for a mystery that would baffle investigators for years. The question is, where did she go, and who was the last person to see her alive? This true crime story will take you step by step through the dark twists and turns of an unexpected disappearance. I will keep the screen dark if you are trying to sleep. Let's get to it. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, the kind that fades easily from memory. The two young women living in the modest two-bedroom apartment had spent the night like so many others, quietly and without incident. For 23-year-old Lauren Spearer, a vibrant Indiana University student, the night had begun with plans to relax, catch up with friends, and unwind. Her last class had ended hours ago, and she was eager for the informal gatherings that were a regular part of campus life. By the time her roommate, Kara, left for the evening to visit her parents in nearby Bloomington, Lauren was already busy texting friends and finalizing the evening's loose plans. Later that night, around 11:30 p.m., Kara returned home to find the apartment dark and quiet. Nothing seemed out of place at first. She assumed Lauren was either out for a late-night walk, something she often did to clear her head, or taking longer than expected to return from visiting friends. It wasn't unusual in their circle of college acquaintances to come and go at odd hours, especially during the summer months when Bloomington slowed to a relaxed pace. The air still carried the fresh bite of spring even as summer settled in, and it made those midnight strolls feel almost serene. But this time, as minutes turned into hours, the serenity gave way to something else: unease. By 2 a.m., Kara found herself lying awake in bed, staring at the empty mattress across the room. Lauren's side of the room had always been a mixture of tidy and chaotic, with notebooks stacked haphazardly next to her laptop, shoes kicked into random corners, and a half-empty water bottle perched precariously on the edge of her desk. Tonight, it looked the same as always, as if Lauren had just stepped out and would be back at any moment. Her favorite denim jacket still hung on the back of her chair, the watch she always wore was resting on her dresser, and her phone charger was looped neatly on the nightstand. But Lauren wasn't there. The small glow of a street lamp outside their bedroom window was enough to illuminate the clock on the wall. As Kara watched the hands creep closer to 3 a.m., the unease turned into a nagging worry she couldn't shake. Kara had been Lauren's roommate for long enough to know that, despite her outgoing and adventurous personality, she wasn't one to vanish into the night without saying a word. Even when Lauren was engrossed in her own plans, she kept her roommate in the loop. Running late, don't wait up, or spent too much on snacks again, see you tomorrow, were simple updates that had become part of their weekday routines. Tonight, there were no texts or calls, no updates, just the quiet hum of their apartment, broken only by the occasional soft creak of the building settling. By 4 a.m., Kara felt dizzy from scanning the same mental checklist. Was she really out? Could she have fallen asleep at a friend's place without telling her? Or worse, had she gotten hurt? The questions piled on top of one another, unanswered and overwhelming. Standing in the doorway of their room, she glanced around once more, as if the act of looking could summon her back. But Lauren's perfectly made bed, with its folded blanket at the foot, only fueled her anxiety. She flicked through their text messages, searching for some sign she might have missed. The last one from Lauren simply read, "Be back soon," sent at 9:47 p.m. It was all too ordinary, nothing that suggested anything unusual, at least to Kara's tired and racing thoughts. Hours later, as the first traces of dawn began filtering into their apartment, Kara finally picked up her phone and hesitantly dialed Lauren's number. It rang, and rang, and rang again. Voicemail. Next, she called some of Lauren's closest friends, asking if any of them had seen her. Most of them had last spotted Lauren late in the evening, leaving the apartment complex. One friend said she saw Lauren walking alone near the intersection of College Avenue, a busy corner known for its bars and restaurants. But beyond that, no one seemed to know where she had gone. Each call ended in the same sinking feeling. By the time authorities were contacted later that morning, it was already clear to Kara and to everyone else close to Lauren that this wasn't a simple disappearance. There was no sign that she had packed for a trip or intended to disappear on purpose. Her most valued belongings, her keys, wallet, and phone, were all exactly where she always left them. Her ID was still nestled in the side pocket of her bag. While Lauren valued her independence and spontaneity, she wasn't the kind of person who would wander off without taking essentials with her. And if something had happened to her, perhaps a mugging gone wrong or an accident, Why had no one reported seeing a struggle, hearing a scream, or noticing someone out of place? A chill crept over Kara as she considered the possibilities. This wasn't just late-night confusion. Whatever was going on, it was far more serious than she had initially thought. When police arrived, they conducted a quick walkthrough of the apartment. Small and unassuming, it was the kind of place rented by young college students with modest incomes. The investigators examined every corner of the room for anything that might stand out. A piece of paper with a note scribbled in a hurry, a window left cracked open. Everything remained eerily static, frozen in place, as if Lauren had simply vanished. One detective later remarked that it was the kind of scene that left you unsettled. Instead of finding explanations, you were left chasing ghosts. But then came the moment that haunted her roommate most. It wasn't just the empty bed or the altogether too ordinary state of the belongings. There was no overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle. It was the shoes that stopped her cold. Lauren's shoes, the ones she wore almost every day when stepping out, still sat neatly by the front door. That detail alone sent a chill through the room. While she could have left the apartment in another pair, it was unusual and out of character for her to leave without those. It was, in essence, the kind of subtle clue investigators would later say helped reinforce one alarming truth. Lauren hadn't left that apartment for a casual errand or spontaneous outing. Something unforeseen had happened. So what now? As early as the first few hours of the investigation, detectives had but one goal: retrace Lauren's last steps. Conversations with witnesses would only help so much. They knew quickly that the physical evidence, or lack thereof, might be their best chance at uncovering her movements. What did the empty apartment hold that they had missed in those initial scans? For the police, the first critical task was piecing together the quiet mysteries left behind. But as the day ticked past and hope of finding Lauren safely began to dwindle, they couldn't escape an ominous possibility creeping into every corner of their theories. Whatever happened to Lauren Spearer that night, her disappearance was connected to someone or something skilled at evasion. What would come next would not just test the resolve of her friends and family, but challenge the very limits of the investigators on the case. So what did the investigators find when they began to search for those first critical clues? How would the quiet details of an untouched apartment speak louder than any words? The apartment stood as if frozen in time, every item meticulously locked in its place, as if still anticipating Lauren's return. Investigators arrived mid-morning, stepping into her shared living space with the kind of caution that came with experience. The small, tidy entry hall opened into a modest living room, its worn carpets and mismatched furniture giving off the unmistakable charm of a student's budget. It was clear that this space wasn't prepared for visitors but made for quiet moments spent alone or with friends. Posters of indie bands and faded family photos dotted the walls, reminders of two vibrant young women building their worlds within this little home. Yet, despite its warmth, the silence inside felt heavy, pressing down on each intruder as they worked to piece together Lauren's story. Her roommate's initial walkthrough had already suggested that nothing looked disturbed. There were no signs of forced entry. No belongings appeared to be missing, at least not at first glance. However, as investigators began their own scan of the apartment, the stillness seemed almost unnatural, as though it held something back. Everyday items could tell stories, but only if the puzzle pieces fit. It is the unseen details and the smallest, overlooked irregularities that often make the difference in a case like this. Lauren's room was the obvious starting point. Her bed, untouched and tucked perfectly, lay opposite Kara's, a reminder of just how abruptly she had disappeared. On the desk sat a notebook with its pen clipped neatly inside, next to an open laptop resting in standby mode. The only sound came from the faint hum of the refrigerator in the other room. No mugs sat abandoned on counters, no faint laundry scent lingered in the air. It was as if everything had been paused. But among this orderliness, one detail raised immediate questions. Lauren's keys, her lifeline to her apartment, her car, and her daily routine were conspicuously absent, and yet her wallet and phone sat untouched on the nightstand. Officers took note. Where were Lauren's keys? Had she taken them on her way out the door, or had they vanished with her, perhaps now sitting somewhere they didn't belong? The absence of such a fundamentally important item highlighted the very strangeness of the entire situation. It was one of the first things to suggest she hadn't consciously left intending to go far. In the kitchen, nothing appeared disrupted either. The sink was empty, the counters meticulously clean aside from a stray bracelet left by the sink. Kara confirmed it belonged to Lauren, one of her favorites in fact, though she wore it almost constantly. Most people might not have noticed it at all, but detectives instantly flagged it. One officer later commented, "Leaving behind something sentimental like jewelry, it stands out. It's a subtle sign we've seen before. It suggested she wasn't acting on her usual habits when she left." Then came the living room. The unlocked front door caught the attention of the team. While some might wave off an unlocked door as forgetfulness, it felt unusual here, an indicator of something more. Kara had remembered locking the door earlier that evening, long before Lauren's "be back soon" text. Lauren, too, wasn't the sort to forget. Simple things like locking up were second nature for a woman navigating her independence among friends and strangers alike. The police marked it as another small detail that didn't line up, a crack in the otherwise normal pattern of life within this space. While forensic experts began their survey for hidden evidence, such as fingerprints, smudges, and fibers, the lead investigator paced through the apartment, processing its stillness. Personal belongings often told their own stories. In this case, it wasn't just what Lauren had taken or left behind that puzzled them, but what hadn't been disturbed. The picture frames remained undisturbed, and mail lay scattered in its usual spot on the dining table. There was no broken furniture or overturned chairs. It felt sterile, yet suffocating. The first real break arrived when Kara unearthed what she had initially missed. Digging through the shared laundry bin, she found a shirt Lauren had been wearing earlier that week, the one she typically paired with high-waisted shorts and flat white sneakers, a basic staple of her wardrobe. On closer inspection, Kara noticed faint discoloration above the hem, a reddish smear, so faint it could have been missed entirely. She hesitated before calling it to the investigators' attention. From there, it was sent to the forensics lab. Police weren't prepared to draw immediate conclusions, but officers acknowledged the significance of any potentially blood-like stain, no matter how faint. It wasn't just the mark itself. It was the question of why such a thing would exist there in the first place. Had something gone unnoticed earlier that week, or was this now a tangible connection to something darker? Outside Lauren's room, another oddity began to shape the theory of foul play. Her shoes were all accounted for. Lauren wasn't one to go far without them, especially her everyday sneakers, which still sat neatly by the door. This detail carried weight. It suggested, unequivocally, that she hadn't been planning for a long walk or errand. In the minds of the officers, it raised questions around mobility or coercion. Either Lauren had been taken, or she had left in an extremely atypical state. As details emerged from the physical space, suggesting irregularities, investigators layered professional insights into the mix. Survivability windows in missing persons cases shrank rapidly when evidence failed to signal voluntary absence. Without her keys, shoes, or any alert to her social circle, the narrative began shifting. One investigator noted, "Explaining anomalies in victims' routines is crucial in hours like this. We don't just focus on where someone might go, but why, what stays behind is unusual." These tiny inconsistencies began stacking into a mosaic too detailed to ignore. Police began looking into movements from the night before, latching on to potential explanations that could connect the gaps left behind without Lauren's presence to anchor the space. By mid-afternoon, the apartment's silence weighed heavier still. But police strategies began turning outward. Reconstructing Lauren's last known footsteps relied on the surrounding community and whoever had caught even the smallest glimpse before events turned sinister. Who, if anyone, had seen her leave through the lane-facing stairwell stretching beyond both her apartment and into public space? Kara's account of the night Lauren vanished painted a picture of normalcy, at least at first. She recalled Lauren leaving the apartment around 6:30 p.m., her phone tucked into her pocket, as she made plans to meet friends. Based on the texts exchanged earlier in the day, her evening didn't seem out of the ordinary. A few hours of catching up with friends on College Avenue before heading back home. Lauren's message, "Be back soon," was sent a little before 10 p.m., leaving Kara to assume she wouldn't be gone late. It was a routine similar to so many others. But as the details unfolded, what Kara described seemed less like a typical night and more like the beginning of a series of concerning gaps. Kara admitted she didn't think much of Lauren's absence initially. As soon as she received that text, she figured Lauren might just lose track of time, something college students often did. Kara busied herself with her own plans that evening, casually glancing at her phone every now and then, but with no real urgency. It wasn't until several hours later, past midnight, that she started to feel uneasy. Kara explained to investigators that she had sent a couple of follow-up texts, including one asking if Lauren needed a ride home. It was something they regularly did for one another, but when hours passed without any response, she tried calling, only for it to go straight to voicemail. It felt strange, Kara later recounted. Lauren wasn't the type to ignore calls, especially if she knew I was waiting for her. That was the first moment Kara felt the situation might not be typical. Yet even then, she hesitated to act. The idea of calling the police so soon seemed dramatic. What if Lauren was fine? No one wanted to overreact. Still, investigators couldn't ignore a crucial detail. While Kara claimed she felt concern creep in around midnight, it wasn't until almost 7 hours later that she decided to contact authorities. For those first hours, she tried to rationalize Lauren's absence. Perhaps she had crashed at a friend's place, or maybe her phone had died. According to Kara, these were the explanations she clung to in the middle of the night, even as her anxiety started to mount. When morning came and there was still no sign of Lauren, Kara explained that her dread reached a breaking point. "That's when I finally realized something was seriously wrong," she told detectives. This delay became a point investigators couldn't overlook. What caused her to wait so long? In many missing persons cases, especially those involving adults, reporting delays can muddy the critical first hours of an investigation. Police pressed Kara for more clarity, hoping to understand not just her actions but her thought process. Some of her answers only raised more questions. For instance, when describing how she spent those hours waiting for Lauren to come home, certain details came across as contradictory. Kara claimed she checked Lauren's favorite hangouts by texting mutual friends, but when police reviewed phone records, there appeared to be fewer outgoing messages than she had mentioned. This discrepancy wasn't conclusive, but it hinted at a potential complication in her story. Investigators started to look at her statements less as a straightforward narrative and more as a series of pieces that didn't quite fit together. One detail in particular caught their attention. Kara admitted she had noticed Lauren's shoes, her unmistakable white sneakers, sitting by the door as she paced through the apartment that night. Despite this, she still believed Lauren might have gone out walking. When pressed, she said she didn't think it was unusual at the time. "I know it sounds strange now, but I didn't put it together then," Kara remarked during questioning. Lauren had other shoes. It didn't seem like a big deal. But detectives found this reasoning hard to accept. Lauren's sneakers weren't just a favorite pair. They were practically her uniform for daily errands and nights out alike. Leaving them behind seemed out of character, and Kara's explanation felt thin. It wasn't enough to accuse her of withholding information, but it was enough to make investigators question the full picture. There was also the issue of the front door. In her account, Kara stated that she had locked the door when Lauren left earlier in the evening. Still, when the police arrived the following morning, they found it unlocked. This raised another important question. Had Kara herself unlocked it during the night, or had someone else gained access? Kara struggled to explain this inconsistency. "I must have forgotten," she told them, her voice wavering. "I honestly don't remember." To investigators, her uncertainty felt less like forgetfulness and more like an effort to avoid a direct answer. As detectives questioned Kara further, it became clear that being a witness, or even just the person closest to Lauren, was taking its toll on her. She fumbled through parts of her timeline, repeating certain details while backtracking on others. This wasn't entirely unusual. For people under the weight of police questioning, the pressure to be accurate while managing grief or confusion could lead to missteps. One officer later remarked, "It's not always about whether someone is lying outright. Sometimes the stress of the moment makes even truthful people come across as suspicious." Even so, Kara's narrative sat at the center of their investigation, and every inconsistency became a loose thread they couldn't ignore. On the surface, Kara appeared cooperative. She answered questions willingly, worked with police to identify Lauren's closest friends, and helped comb through local spots Lauren might have gone. But as they dug deeper into her accounts, small cracks began to form in the foundation of her innocence. A neighbor reported hearing what they described as raised voices near the apartment around 11 p.m., the night Lauren disappeared. While the description of the voices couldn't confirm their identities, the timing aligned too closely to dismiss. When asked, Kara claimed she hadn't heard any argument that night, maintaining her position that the apartment had been quiet. This added another layer of uncertainty. If she truly had nothing to hide, why would she downplay details that might help piece things together? The strain of being questioned only grew heavier as the hours stretched on. Kara found herself not just Lauren's last known point of contact, but also the center of investigators' doubts. Without any definitive evidence pointing her way, there was no basis for calling her a suspect outright. But her timeline, how long she waited to raise concerns, how casual her response initially seemed, was a puzzle in its own right. She insisted over and over again. I didn't think it was serious at first. I thought she'd come back. But could her belief in Lauren's safety have blinded her to the signs of danger? The nature of their relationship came under quiet scrutiny. Friends described Kara and Lauren as close, though not inseparable. They had only lived together for a year, but by all accounts, there were no deeply rooted issues between them. However, there were hints of friction in their daily lives. Small disagreements about chores or shared spaces. One friend pointed out that they were just different people. Lauren, always social and outgoing, preferred to keep a busy schedule. Kara, quieter and more introverted, enjoyed her downtime in the apartment. It wasn't enough to suggest tension beyond what most roommates experience, but the investigators wondered if a hidden rift between them could explain Kara's reluctance to act quickly. As they wrapped up their interviews with her, the detectives knew Kara's account would need further scrutiny. Her timeline of the night would soon become a focal point, not just for its inconsistencies but for what it might reveal about Lauren's last hours. One thing had already become painfully clear. Kara's hesitation, whether deliberate or not, had left them chasing a clock that wouldn't stop ticking. But as the focus shifted to their relationship, new layers of complexity began to emerge. Were there dynamics beneath the surface that could shed light on what had happened that night? And if there were secrets, how had they been hidden in plain sight? Lauren and Kara were like many roommates, brought together less by friendship and more by convenience. They met through mutual friends in their first year at Indiana University and, after briefly bonding over the need to find affordable housing, decided to move in together. By most accounts, they got along well enough. They were similar in age but wildly different in personality. Lauren was bubbly, social, and constantly surrounded by friends. Kara, by contrast, kept to herself more. She preferred quiet nights in and rarely joined Lauren on her weekend outings. Their relationship worked largely because they respected each other's boundaries. At least, that's what it looked like from the outside. Friends of the pair described their setup as typical. Lauren and Kara shared chores but didn't have a structured schedule. Lauren often took the lead in keeping common areas tidy, while Kara helped manage shared bills. They weren't best friends, but they seemed fine, one acquaintance said. I never got the sense there was big drama. Others echoed this sentiment. The two coexisted, but their lives didn't overlap much beyond the shared apartment. It was a practical arrangement, not a deep personal connection. Still, investigators began to wonder how well anyone truly understood their dynamics. The early stages of the case focused heavily on Kara's account, and her role as Lauren's roommate automatically placed her under a microscope. Police dug into their living arrangements, curious if unresolved tensions or issues might have played a role in Lauren's disappearance. What they discovered were subtle inconsistencies. Nothing overtly alarming, but enough to suggest the relationship wasn't as seamless as it appeared. Neighbors provided intriguing anecdotes. One described hearing occasional arguments through the thin apartment walls. It wasn't constant or violent, the neighbor clarified, but sometimes you'd hear them raising their voices at each other. Another neighbor mentioned noticing long stretches where Kara seemed to avoid Lauren entirely. It was like they had different schedules on purpose, the neighbor remarked. Kara would come home when she knew Lauren wasn't there. These accounts, while not proof of anything sinister, painted a picture of two people who shared space but sometimes barely interacted. One particular incident stood out. A few months before Lauren vanished, the two had a minor dispute over a party Lauren hosted in the apartment. Kara, who'd been studying for an exam that weekend, had reportedly stormed out after finding the living room packed with Lauren's friends. She was pretty upset, one of Lauren's friends recalled. She left without saying much and didn't come back until the next day. Police learned there were no major repercussions, no threats or lasting resentment. But the story added a layer of tension to what was otherwise considered a functional arrangement. A deeper dive into Lauren and Kara's routines revealed subtle patterns of friction. Kara seemed to value her privacy more than Lauren, and there were mild disagreements about boundaries. For example, Lauren sometimes borrowed Kara's dishes or other items without asking. Small things that Kara, according to friends, occasionally vented about but never escalated. She'd complain to us, one mutual friend said, but nothing serious. Just typical roommate stuff like, I wish she'd stop taking my things every time she has guests. When police pressed Kara about her feelings toward Lauren, she insisted there was no real animosity. We had our moments like anyone else, but we got along, she told investigators. I never felt like we were close, but that didn't mean I didn't care about her. Still, small details began to mount. Kara's hesitation to report Lauren missing, combined with her understated responses about their relationship, left investigators questioning whether there might be deeper grievances lurking beneath the surface. Psychologists brought in to consult on the case noted an important reality about roommate dynamics. Familiarity can mask friction. People living in close quarters often adapt to one another, finding ways to coexist even when tensions simmer. Hidden resentment in shared living situations is common, one expert explained. Roommates may not express every grievance aloud, but over time, those little irritations can build up. It doesn't mean someone is violent or dangerous, but it creates an emotional disconnect. This insight resonated with investigators as they examined Kara's seemingly detached behavior in the days after Lauren disappeared. Uncovering the truth about the women's dynamic wasn't just speculation. It was critical to understanding Lauren's last moments. Friends admitted that Lauren occasionally found Kara hard to read and even frustrating at times. She confided in one friend shortly after the party incident, mentioning that Kara wasn't thrilled about how social Lauren's lifestyle was. She said something like, "Kara probably thinks I'm too loud," the friend recalled. "But I figured they were fine. There were no major fights or anything." Interestingly, Lauren's friends described her as the kind of person who avoided conflict. While she thrived in social situations, she wasn't confrontational. "Lauren was nice to everyone," said one close friend. Even if someone annoyed her, she didn't like making a big deal about it. This trait only deepened the mystery. It was hard to imagine her sparking any kind of confrontation that might lead to harm. But what if the issues were one-sided? Investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that Kara may have harbored frustrations Lauren never fully realized. Investigators also uncovered a surprising piece of information midway through their inquiry. Kara had mentioned moving out just days before Lauren disappeared. According to a co-worker, she had expressed concerns about the living arrangement, saying it wasn't working out the way she'd hoped. She didn't go into details but said she was thinking about finding her own place, the co-worker revealed. Police questioned why Kara hadn't brought this up sooner. Kara's explanation was simple. She didn't think it was relevant. She insisted it wasn't about Lauren, just a desire for more personal space. Yet, the timing stood out. If Kara had been considering leaving, had tensions between her and Lauren reached a breaking point? Investigators couldn't say for sure, but the revelation added weight to the notion that their relationship wasn't perfectly harmonized. While Kara continued to cooperate with police, providing access to her phone records and interviews with mutual friends, her reserved demeanor left many wondering what emotions might be hiding beneath the surface. As investigators pieced together the details of their relationship, a clearer but more complicated picture began to emerge. Lauren and Kara were roommates by necessity, not choice. They weren't enemies, but they weren't close enough for deep trust to have developed. Their interactions were polite, even friendly at times, but there was an undeniable emotional distance between them. In the absence of a stronger bond, small moments of friction could easily go unnoticed or unaddressed. This new understanding of their dynamic led investigators to reconsider the timeline of Lauren's disappearance. If any argument or altercation had occurred that night, it could explain some of the inconsistencies in Kara's story. However, there was no concrete proof of Kara's involvement, and her cooperation thus far made it difficult to draw any direct conclusions. Still, the insights into their relationship added complexity to the case, shifting the focus onto the interpersonal dynamics that shaped both women's lives. The deeper the investigators looked into Lauren and Kara's shared history, the more questions arose. What hadn't Kara shared about their cohabitation? Were there small conflicts between them that took on more significance in the days leading up to Lauren's disappearance? And if they weren't connected to her vanishing, how might those tensions have affected Kara's choices in the aftermath? With every new development, the case grew murkier. But while the dynamics inside the apartment hinted at possible motives or explanations, the next stage of the investigation turned outward. What evidence outside the four walls they had shared could illuminate the last moments of Lauren's life? And, more importantly, would it point to someone else entirely? When Lauren Spearer's disappearance was officially reported, the clock had already cost investigators precious hours. The first 48 hours are widely considered the most critical in any missing persons case. It's the window where evidence is freshest, interviews are sharpest, and leads are easier to track down. But when investigators arrived at Lauren's apartment that morning, they weren't stepping into a clean slate. They were already fighting time and quickly realizing how much they didn't know about the last hours of Lauren's life. One of the first challenges was the delay between her disappearance and the initial report. Kara's hesitation to call police or notify friends immediately meant investigators were working with a timeline where the trail had already started to go cold. Lauren had left the apartment almost 12 hours earlier by the time officers conducted their first in-depth walkthrough. A morning lost to unmade calls and unanswered texts gave any possible witnesses a wide berth to move on with their lives, unknowingly taking key memories out of reach. The difficulty in missing persons cases often lies in the balance between concern and uncertainty. But in cases involving delays, that concern magnifies. Detective Scott Harrison, one of the leads on the case, later remarked, "You've essentially given a potential suspect half a day to move, hide, or cover their tracks. That's an eternity." Despite this setback, law enforcement strategized quickly. The first step was establishing a clear picture of Lauren's last known movements. They started with marks of certainty statements from Kara, her time-stamped messages, and sightings of Lauren at a few well-trafficked locations on College Avenue. According to witness accounts, Lauren spent the early evening visiting a nearby friend before heading out to a popular bar. By 9:30 p.m., she was reportedly seen chatting amiably with friends near the bar's front patio. But by 10:15, that same group recalled her excusing herself to take a quick walk back to her apartment before the night's plans continued. It was this window just before 11 p.m., until the early hours of the next day that became the immediate focus of the investigation. Officers canvassed the area surrounding her apartment, questioning passers-by and nearby residents. The route Lauren would have taken on foot was simple, just a straight cut through a neighborhood block. But no one seemed to have definitive answers. One neighbor recalled seeing a woman resembling Lauren walking along the sidewalk but couldn't confidently confirm the sighting. Others in the area admitted to being home but didn't hear or see anything unusual. "It's frustrating when you know someone must have spotted something," an officer reflected years later. But people don't know what they don't know. If they thought it was nothing, they'd forget it by the next morning. The police turned to local businesses along the route, hoping for luck with surveillance cameras. But this effort came with its own hurdles. Many of the nearby shops either didn't use security systems or used outdated ones with limited angles and poor visibility at night. The few cameras that did capture parts of the street didn't reveal any sign of Lauren during the critical hours. Whatever route she took, it didn't intersect with lenses in a way investigators could use. The lack of footage forced them to rely even more heavily on witness accounts, an uneasy prospect when people's memories degrade so quickly under pressure. Adding to the challenge was the mixed level of cooperation from those closest to Lauren. While Kara provided a detailed account of Lauren's evening, her delays in contacting police had already drawn attention. Friends of Lauren were quick to answer questions, but their stories often highlighted how independent Lauren was, leaving routine gaps in her movements harder to pin down. Some reported attempted calls to Lauren's phone, all of which went straight to voicemail. This indicated the phone may have been turned off or had run out of battery or detail, equally frustrating to both her friends and law enforcement. Meanwhile, police began digging deeper into potential patterns showing why Lauren might have disappeared. In many cases like these, lifestyle factors like dating histories or signs of personal conflict provide valuable leads. Lauren, they found, maintained an active social calendar. It wasn't unusual for her to attend multiple gatherings in a single weekend, though she was also careful to check in with friends on her way between stops. But nothing in her routine indicated a tendency to venture off alone or out of contact for long stretches. By all accounts, she was responsible, organized, and firmly grounded in her community. No one her friends could name currently posed a threat to her, at least not as far as they could tell. To expand their search, officers looked beyond the timeline of the evening and began focusing energy on Lauren's digital footprint. Her phone records and social media accounts might tell more: where she'd been texting from, who she last messaged, or whether she had plans with anyone outside her immediate circle before she vanished. Preliminary searches yielded nothing unusual. Her last text, sent to Kara just before 10 p.m., was tracked to a cell tower near her home. But beyond that, her phone's activity ceased almost entirely. There were no outgoing calls or pings to suggest travel far from her apartment. A second search, in and around the apartment complex, led to another troubling discovery. Close to Lauren's typical walking route, officers found a discarded bracelet in a nearby ditch. At first glance, it seemed insignificant, a small accessory like so many others, but Kara confirmed to police that the bracelet belonged to Lauren. She had been wearing it earlier, Kara noted, and it was unlikely she would have removed it. This discovery fueled speculation that something sudden or forceful had occurred, as opposed to Lauren wandering off voluntarily. The bracelet was the first real clue that Lauren didn't just vanish on her own. A sergeant on the case later recalled, "It's one thing to misplace something, and another to have it left behind like that." But the revelation came with more questions. How did Lauren's bracelet end up off her person in a ditch so close to her route home, yet with no evidence of larger disturbances nearby? Investigators considered possibilities involving robbery or an impulsive act of violence. But with no eyewitnesses to suggest a struggle, the item's presence felt more like a whisper than a statement clue that there was much more hidden just out of reach. During these first 48 hours, police worked non-stop to generate any lead, turning to public appeals to prompt witnesses to come forward. But splitting their energy between Lauren's friends, family, and community built its own difficulties. Media outlets began local coverage of her disappearance, airing interviews from tearful loved ones pleading for her safe return. The outpouring of concern flooded the Bloomington police station with hundreds of tips, everything from long-shot sightings at grocery stores to claims of hearing unusual noises the night she vanished. But as promising as some tips sounded, most were hard to substantiate or led nowhere. One piece of information began to shift the course of the case. A man stepped forward, claiming he had seen a woman matching Lauren's description near the corner of College Avenue, right around 10:45 p.m. He remembered her passing by as he exited his parked car. But what struck him wasn't just that he'd seen her walking alone, it was the pair of headlights slowing behind her. According to the witness's account, a vehicle moving hesitantly along the curb seemed to match her path for a minute before disappearing into another street nearby. The man couldn't identify the car's make or model, but that brief, suggestive movement was enough to deepen investigators' suspicions. This was the first tangible step in connecting Lauren's disappearance to outside interference. A vehicle following close to a lone figure late at night could mean nothing. It could be everything. It raised unsettling new possibilities that pointed away from chance and towards something calculated. But who was inside that car? And how close had they come to Lauren in those fleeting minutes? As investigators prepared to follow up on this lead, they were faced with a growing realization. Those early hours weren't coming back. The picture of Lauren's disappearance wasn't complete, but with every potential clue, it was growing darker. And now the question wasn't just where she was, but what had brought her there. What else was waiting to be uncovered as they followed the car's shadow into the night? The breakthrough came when investigators received a call from a local property manager about something unusual in their parking lot. It was now almost a week since Lauren had disappeared, and while the investigative team had been chasing leads and mapping out timelines, nothing had led them closer to understanding where she was or what had happened to her. The property manager explained that one of their tenants, noticing an abandoned vehicle parked at the edge of the lot, had alerted them. It wasn't unusual for cars to sit in the lot for a day or two, but this one was different. There was something about its condition that stood out. The vehicle, an older model sedan with faded paint, had its windows rolled down slightly and a layer of dirt streaking its surface. But what really caught their attention was what was inside. On the driver's seat was a smudged handprint that appeared to be in some kind of dried residue. On the passenger side, crumpled clothing and an empty fast food cup lay scattered on the floorboards. The car didn't match any of the current residents at the complex, and neither the property manager nor the tenants could recall seeing who had parked it there. It was clear it hadn't been sitting long. No tickets were left on the windshield, but the fact that it was abandoned indicated someone had walked away on purpose. When police arrived to investigate, they quickly noticed another detail. The vehicle was missing its license plates. This meant tracking the owner wouldn't be as straightforward. A VIN number search would eventually link the car to a nearby dealership, but in the meantime, the car itself would need to be examined carefully. One of the officers on the scene immediately flagged the handprint for further analysis. It was faded, uneven, he later said, but there was enough there to give us something solid to work with. The car was towed to the crime lab, where forensic analysts went over every inch of it. Inside, they found items that could only be described as puzzling. Among them was a partially torn receipt from the bar where Lauren was last seen. Dated the night of her disappearance, the receipt didn't belong to Lauren herself but pointed to someone who had been at the same location. Investigators also recovered a single strand of blonde hair from the back seat. While they couldn't confirm whose it was immediately, its presence raised important questions. Could the vehicle have been connected to Lauren's last movements? And if so, who had been driving it? The receipt became an early focus. It wasn't just another random item, it represented a direct link to the evening Lauren vanished. Officers returned to the bar to pull receipts matching the timestamp. The transaction, paid in cash, couldn't connect to a name directly, but it revealed what had been ordered: 2 drinks and a small food item. Witnesses were brought back in for more questioning. One recalled seeing a man sitting at a corner table, taking occasional glances toward the bar's main door. Another patron recognized the description of the car parked at the complex and mentioned seeing it outside the bar's lot earlier that night. But the driver? No one could describe them clearly. While this clue was enough to reignite the investigation, it also contradicted earlier assumptions. Police had spent much of the first days fixated on Lauren's usual habits and social connections. They'd conducted interviews with friends, former romantic partners, and classmates, working under the theory that someone close to her might hold answers. But this new evidence, the abandoned car and receipt hinted at the involvement of someone outside her circle, an unknown variable that shifted the investigation's scope. The forensic team worked quickly to process the car. Swabs from the smudged handprint on the driver's seat didn't yield enough for identification, but further analysis of the interior uncovered another significant clue. Along the edges of the passenger door, analysts found faint traces of blood. It wasn't visible at first glance, but became clear under testing. The sample was too small to establish a major profile, but preliminary results suggested it matched Lauren's blood type. This changed everything. Until now, Lauren's disappearance had been treated as suspicious, but there was no direct evidence to prove foul play. Now, the presence of the blood brought a darker possibility to the forefront. Detectives began linking this case to similar stories. In missing persons investigations, abandoned vehicles have often been the key to breaking cases wide open. In one well-known case from Arizona in 2013, a missing college student's car was found under similar circumstances, containing seemingly mundane items: an old textbook, a water bottle, and a single shoe. It wasn't much, but it eventually led officers to a suspect who had encountered the victim hours before her disappearance. In Lauren's case, the investigators wondered whether this car would unlock similar answers or leave them chasing dead ends. Still, while the car and its contents raised critical questions, they didn't provide any definitive answers yet. If the receipt and the hair found in the car suggested proximity to Lauren, why had no one noticed this vehicle before? Security footage from the bar parking lot had already been reviewed, but the poor visibility made it impossible to make out license plates or faces of anyone near it. The vague witness descriptions were too broad to rely on, leaving police with only fragmented possibilities. The car dealership linked to the VIN number offered a sliver of insight. They confirmed the sedan had been sold at an auction the month before, but hadn't yet been re-registered under a new owner's name. This added a complication. Whoever was driving the car the night Lauren disappeared hadn't left a trace of themselves behind in official records. Detectives widened their search, turning to neighboring towns and vehicle sightings to see if a pattern emerged. But it was the hair sample that pulled the investigation into sharper focus. When forensic analysts ran DNA testing, the results confirmed what investigators suspected. The sample belonged to Lauren. That single discovery changed the direction of the case entirely. No longer were police searching for someone who simply might have seen Lauren. They were now looking for someone who had her in their vehicle that night. The question of whether she left her apartment voluntarily became irrelevant. What mattered now was who she had encountered, and what role they played in her disappearance. As police followed the threads connecting the vehicle to its broader context, the car opened up more avenues than conclusions. Wherever it had travelled after the night Lauren vanished, it carried her presence with it. But its discovery also exposed holes in the larger story. Why had the car been abandoned less than 3 miles from her apartment? Was it dumped there by someone local? Or was it a convenient spot for a visitor unfamiliar with the area? These uncertainties hung over the investigation as officers began exploring the possibility that Lauren's disappearance was the work of someone who hadn't intended to be caught. While the car offered concrete evidence, tangible remnants of Lauren's last known moments also raised countless new questions. So far, the only person it directly pointed to was Lauren herself, leaving the mystery of the driver unresolved. And, as investigators pushed forward, they began narrowing their sights on uncovering the final, most important question of all: who had been behind the wheel? What lay on the other side of the car's presence would bring the investigation into sharper focus. But the evidence didn't just stop at the driver. There was still the question of what this person knew and how it connected to Lauren's fate. Where the car led next would determine whether this case moved one step closer to resolution or simply deepened the mystery further. Witnesses can often shape the difference between a mystery that drags on for years and one that finds answers quickly. But in Lauren Spearer's case, convincing those who might have seen something to step forward wasn't easy. Lauren vanished on the edge of a bustling college toner place where lives intersect daily, where bars and apartments sit close together, and where dozens of people might have unknowingly crossed her path that night. Despite this, investigators found themselves chasing silence, faces turning away, and answers left half-finished. One of the first barriers investigators encountered was hesitation. Witnesses who had been close to the area near Lauren's apartment or College Avenue admitted they'd been out that night, walking home from bars or hanging out on balconies overlooking the street. Yet when it came to recalling specific details, their answers were vague or inconsistent. Some admitted they didn't pay close attention because late-night comings and goings were common in a college town. Others, however, expressed a more troubling reason. They were scared. One student told police, "I don't know if I feel safe talking about this. What if the person who took her is still around?" Fear played a significant role in how this case unfolded in the critical early days. People often worry that coming forward could expose them to danger, even when they have only tangential information. Police speculated this fear grew as media coverage of Lauren's disappearance intensified. With headlines splashing Lauren's photo across local outlets and her parents making emotional pleas on television, the case felt bigger than ever. Seeing the magnitude of attention, some potential witnesses may have decided it was easier and safer to stay silent, reasoning that their minor observations might not matter in the larger scope of the investigation. But fear wasn't the only obstacle. There was also loyalty. Colleges and their surrounding communities often operate within tight-knit social groups. In the days following Lauren's disappearance, it became evident to police that people in her social circle may have known more than they initially let on. Detectives began revisiting those who had seen Lauren the night she was last spotted. Some admitted they'd noticed others behaving strangely that evening, but they were reluctant to name names. "You don't want to accuse someone without being sure," one friend said during questioning. Others deflected entirely, avoiding follow-up calls or responding vaguely when pressed for details. Part of this hesitation stemmed from the fear of implicating someone who could be innocent a valid concern in any investigation. But it also underscored another truth. Loyalty can be a powerful silencer. For those close to the case, the unspoken rules of social groups protect your friends, avoid gossip, keep quiet unless you're certain became barriers to the flow of critical information. This phenomenon isn't uncommon, especially in cases involving tight communities. People hesitate not just because of fear, but because of the social cost of speaking up. Distrust also played a role. Though Bloomington was generally a safe area with a good relationship between law enforcement and its college population, there were still pockets of suspicion. Some students expressed that they didn't entirely trust police to protect their identity or handle information sensitively. One witness shared this sentiment, saying she worried about her name being attached to the case without her control. Police tried to address these concerns through anonymous tips, lines, and assurances that witnesses wouldn't be exposed unnecessarily. Still, trust is hard to build once doubt takes hold, especially in a case this high profile, where media coverage made every development a headline. Recognizing the need to approach witnesses carefully, investigators switched tactics. They began conducting targeted interviews in neutral locations, giving witnesses an opportunity to talk without feeling scrutinized. Officers canvassed the area surrounding Lauren's apartment, speaking to neighbors who may have noticed anything unusual that night. They also put up posters and left contact information in mailboxes to encourage tips, particularly from those who might not feel comfortable speaking face-to-face. In many instances, even indirect observation sharing the sound of footsteps, seeing a car slow down resolved small pieces of the investigative puzzle. But still, the lack of definitive developments was frustrating. How could no one have seen more? Public appeals were another important strategy. Lauren's family directly addressed the community in an emotional plea, asking for cooperation and urging anyone with even the smallest detail to contact police. They made it clear they weren't trying to cast blame, but simply find answers. "We know someone out there knows something," her father said during a television appearance. "We're asking, no, begging you to do the right thing and help bring Lauren home." The appeals sparked some movement. Tips began to trickle in, though not all of them led anywhere. One caller claimed they'd seen a woman matching Lauren's description get into a car with two men near a convenience store, but when police reviewed surveillance footage, they found no such interaction occurred at the stated time. The witness later admitted their memory might have been compromised by alcohol. As police sorted through tips, they began using surveillance in areas where eyewitness accounts seemed unreliable. They set up patrols near College Avenue and monitored traffic around the apartment complex where Lauren lived, hoping for repeated patterns or encounters that might hint at someone hanging around too often. Surveillance allowed investigators to fill gaps where human recollection faltered, providing a clearer view of who frequented the area and when. But even with these additional efforts, No single lead emerged strong enough to push the case forward until someone unexpected stepped up. A reluctant witnesser regular at the bar Lauren had visited that night eventually contacted police. They explained they hadn't come forward earlier because they weren't sure what they'd seen and didn't want to get involved in something bigger than they could handle. But after talking to a friend, they realized withholding what they knew could mean leaving the family without answers. The witness described parking their car near College Avenue and noticing a man standing beside an older sedan, possibly the same one linked to the abandoned vehicle police later found. The man appeared agitated, pacing along the sidewalk and glancing frequently toward the bar's entrance. The witness couldn't confirm they saw Lauren interact directly with him, but they said his body language seemed unusual, like he was waiting for something or someone. This tip was far from the smoking gun investigators hoped for, but it put renewed energy into their efforts. Combined with earlier testimony that a car had been seen following Lauren, it gave the abandoned vehicle a sharper context. It also corroborated theories that someone outside of Lauren's immediate circle might have played a role in her disappearance. The pacing man likely knew Lauren was there or, worse, had intentionally targeted her. Though the witness couldn't provide a full description of the man or his intentions, their testimony shifted the focus of the investigation. Now, police were certain the car wasn't just a coincidence. It was a piece of a larger story, one of movement, hesitation, and someone waiting for the exact right moment to act. Investigators fanned out with renewed purpose, knowing this witness's information might create the chain reaction they desperately needed. If this new lead had substance, it could change everything. Who was the man loitering near the car, and how did his actions intersect with Lauren's timeline? Witness reluctance once, a barrier was finally beginning to erode, making way for details that could reshape the investigation entirely. The car was no longer just evidence of Lauren's absence. It was now a marker of possibility, guiding police closer to a startling truth they couldn't yet see. What did this man know, and why had he stood in the shadows of that night, pacing as though something unimaginable was about to happen? In the days following Lauren's disappearance, the investigation remained focused on finding a missing person. There was still no clear evidence of foul play, no confirmed sightings, and no definitive indication that anything beyond an unexpected absence had occurred. But as days stretched into a week, and the evidence began piling up in unsettling ways, the tone of the investigation shifted. At what point does a disappearance, marked by unanswered calls and vague timelines, become something far more sinister? For investigators, that moment came when patterns began, forming patterns that didn't just hint at danger, but pointed directly toward it. The shift started with the forensic discoveries tied to the abandoned vehicle. The bracelet left in the ditch was one thing it could be explained as accidental, easily dropped. But the faint traces of blood found inside the car told a different story. That small detail forced investigators to confront an uncomfortable reality. If Lauren had been in that car at all, she hadn't left on her own terms. What cemented their suspicions further was the confirmation that a strand of hair recovered from the vehicle belonged to Lauren. The evidence wasn't just circumstantial anymore. It was physical, tangible, and it pointed to something far more deliberate than a college student losing her way. At this stage, law enforcement brought in specialized units to expand their reach and capabilities. Missing persons detectives became criminal investigators overnight. Analysts trained in major cases joined the effort, revisiting early witness statements and combing through new tips that continued pouring in. A team of forensic experts returned to the scene with fresh eyes, this time treating it as a potential crime scene rather than just the last place Lauren had been seen. Even tracking dogs were brought into the wooded areas around College Avenue, tasked with picking up what limited scent trails still lingered after days of summer heat and passing traffic. The transition wasn't immediate, but it was deliberate. Detectives understood what each new clue suggested, even if they weren't ready to make it public just yet. Cases like Lauren's often reach this transition point quietly, with no grand announcements or dramatic discoveries. Instead, it's a gradual realization evidence stacking higher and higher until no other explanation makes sense. By the end of the first week, the timeline of Lauren's last known movements had been revised and tightened. Investigators now knew she had left the bar just after 10:30 p.m. She had been seen briefly by a passerby, walking with purpose toward her apartment complex. Yet, somewhere between College Avenue and home, she vanished. Accounts of a car following her along the curb gained weight when combined with the witness who described seeing a man pacing near an older sedan. These fragments of information painted a troubling picture. Lauren's disappearance was now more than a personal tragedy, it was beginning to look like a crime. But even as investigators leaned into this new theory, they faced significant hurdles. Legally, treating a missing persons case as a criminal investigation requires meeting specific criteria. Without definitive signs of foul play, law enforcement must tread carefully to avoid crossing boundaries or violating rights. Bloomington detectives relied on procedural tools to navigate this thin line. They obtained search warrants for the abandoned car and for nearby properties matching the vehicle's registered location. With legal processes in motion, they ensured that any evidence uncovered would hold up in court if when it became necessary. Additionally, they ramped up public engagement. If Lauren had been taken by someone connected to her or merely passing through town, someone in the area would likely have seen or heard something unusual. Detectives made another public appeal, using local news outlets, emphasizing the need for new witnesses and asking for any dashcam footage from drivers who had been near College Avenue that night. They explained that even seemingly insignificant details like seeing a car parked oddly or spotting someone walking quickly away could add context. The appeal yielded limited results, but it sent a clear signal. This wasn't just a matter of waiting for Lauren to return. The investigation was moving forward, and everything was on the table. By now, mounting evidence had begun reshaping theories within the department. Early suspicions about whether Lauren could have left voluntarily were all but dismissed. Investigators were increasingly confident that someone else's actions were involved. This was never a simple case of someone wanting to disappear. One officer later remarked, Lauren had habits, patterns, people she cared about. The kind of person she was, it didn't match. The focus narrowed toward figuring out who had crossed paths with Lauren that night and what their intentions were. While the transition to a criminal case brought clarity in some ways, it also raised troubling questions. Detectives expanded their search to neighboring towns and counties, widening their net to include individuals with prior records near Bloomington. They also began re-interviewing people who had interacted with Lauren regularly, looking for inconsistencies in their memories or behavior. Kara's timeline, which had already faced scrutiny in earlier stages of the investigation, came under renewed examination. She remained cooperative, providing additional details about Lauren's habits and acquaintances. But detectives couldn't shake a fundamental uncertainty. How well did Kara really know her roommate? Could she have overlooked or withheld information about someone potentially dangerous in Lauren's life? One major challenge came from the lack of definitive eyewitness testimony. Multiple people claimed to have seen Lauren walking alone that night, but none could confirm interactions with anyone else. The moment she stepped out of sight, it was as though she had simply vanished. This invisibility made it crucial for investigators to rely on evidence outside of human memory surveillance footage, cell phone data, and forensic discoveries. But here, too, frustration lingered. Security cameras along College Avenue provided little clarity, capturing only blurred shadows and indistinguishable figures. And Lauren's phone, which had stopped transmitting signals by midnight, offered no further clue to her whereabouts. Among the biggest procedural changes during this phase was the involvement of criminal profiling experts. Drawing from patterns in similar cases, they constructed potential behavioral profiles of who might have been responsible for Lauren's disappearance. Profilers considered the abandoned vehicle, the body language of the man seen pacing, and the lack of physical struggle reported near Lauren's last location. These details pointed to someone methodical, not impulsive, but opportunistic. They knew how to blend into the environment, a profiler speculated. Someone who doesn't stand out but strikes when the opportunity feels right. The ability to transition a case like this requires balancing hope with reality, a challenge for both law enforcement and Lauren's family. Publicly, statements remained focused on finding Lauren alive. Her parents continued to emphasize her vibrant personality and their belief that she could still be brought home. Privately, however, detectives were preparing for every possible outcome. Autopsy protocols were quietly reviewed. Crime scene processes were discussed. And while no one spoke about it directly, the presence of blood in the abandoned car loomed quietly over every conversation. That small stain had made it impossible to ignore the worst possibilities. When law enforcement finally made their formal announcement, there was no going back. The case of Lauren Spearer's disappearance was now considered a potential criminal act. They didn't discuss specific suspects, yet there wasn't enough to go public, but the shift in tone marked an important turning point. This wasn't just a search for a missing woman anymore. It was an active pursuit of answers in what was likely an abduction or worse. The police chief addressed the public in a somber press conference, thanking everyone who had come forward and urging anyone with additional information to do the same. He explained that while Lauren's disappearance was still being treated as a missing persons case technically, investigators were now focusing their resources on uncovering who might have been involved. "This isn't over," he said firmly, "and we're not stopping until we have the truth." Although the announcement offered no immediate breakthroughs, it injected urgency into the community. Suddenly, people who had felt uneasy before were reconsidering whether what they'd seen or heard might matter. The transition to a criminal investigation often has that effect, moving a case from uncertainty into the realm of possibility. But beyond the procedural shift came an even heavier question. If this was truly someone else's doing, then who was the person behind it? What was this new turn in the investigation leading toward? And would the next discovery bring clarity or deepen the unsettling unknown? The disappearance of Lauren Spira left a heavy mark on the small, tight-knit community of Bloomington, Indiana. Her face became imprinted on the consciousness of everyone who walked its street, her photo on every lamppost, her name in every conversation. But years after she vanished, the questions surrounding her case remain as haunting as the night she disappeared. How does a case like this, unsolved and shrouded in unknowns, affect those it touches? More importantly, what does it leave behind? For Lauren's family, the impact has been profound and unrelenting. Her parents, Robert and Charlene, poured themselves into the search, spearheading efforts to keep their daughter's story alive in the press and the public eye. They were relentless in their calls for answers, having traveled to Bloomington numerous times in the months after Lauren's disappearance, speaking at vigils and press conferences with a sense of purpose that never seemed to fade. "We want her to be found," her mother said in one televised interview. "No matter what the outcome is, we just need to know where she is." Their love for Lauren and their refusal to let her case fade into obscurity became a rallying cry for many in the community. The family's determination had a ripple effect in Bloomington, one that reshaped the way students and locals alike thought about safety in public spaces. Before Lauren disappeared, Indiana University was seen as a generally secure campus, with the surrounding area often described as a place where students felt comfortable walking late at night. Lauren's case, however, highlighted vulnerabilities in everyday routine. A familiar walk home could turn into an unspeakable tragedy in the blink of an eye. Parents of students began asking tougher questions about campus security and student behavior, pushing for more visible patrols and better lit pathways. Many students, particularly women, became more cautious, opting to stay in groups or take ride shares instead of walking alone. Local law enforcement also faced scrutiny. While Bloomington's police force had mobilized quickly to investigate Lauren's disappearance, the public couldn't help but question whether earlier involvement could have made a difference. Missing persons cases are notoriously difficult in their early hours, especially when delays in reporting complicate the timeline. In Lauren's case, the time lost during the night she disappeared could never be regained. While officers worked tirelessly to make up for that, the lingering sense that something vital had slipped away remained. Some community members speculated that police might have approached the case differently if clear signs of foul play had been recognized earlier. Others defended the department, arguing that hindsight can make even the best efforts seem inadequate. One area where the case had an undeniable impact was in conversations about personal responsibility and bystander awareness. Friends and peers who had been with Lauren the night she vanished found themselves grappling with difficult questions. Could they have done more to ensure her safety? Should someone have walked her home? "We all assumed she'd be fine," one friend admitted years later. "None of us thought for a second that something bad could happen. Not here." That sense of assumed safety was a comfort that Lauren's disappearance shattered for many young people in the area. It wasn't just about what Lauren's friends could have done differently. It was a broader reckoning with how we support and protect each other in moments that feel mundane until it's too late. The unanswered questions in Lauren's case also reignited debates about how communities handle fear and uncertainty when the unthinkable happens. For every witness who spoke up, there were countless others who stayed silent, whether out of fear, reluctance, or simply uncertainty about what they'd seen. That silence has haunted the case, with detectives repeatedly emphasizing how even the smallest detail could provide a breakthrough. Was it fear of judgment or reprisal that kept potential witnesses quiet? Or was it a symptom of something deeper, an instinct to avoid entangling oneself in something so steeped in tragedy and scrutiny? Experts in criminal justice have pointed to Lauren's case as an example of how vital community cooperation is in missing persons investigations. One former detective spoke about the psychological barriers often faced by witnesses in cases like this. "People think their information has to be groundbreaking to matter, but that's rarely true," he explained. "It's the accumulation of small details, timelines, behaviors, things that seem slightly off that solve cases. but people don't realize that until it's too late. This insight only deepened the frustration surrounding Lauren's disappearance. If one witness, just one, had come forward with something definitive in those early days, would it have changed the trajectory of the investigation? The thought lingers, gnawing at those closest to the case. The broader legacy of Lauren's case extends beyond Bloomington. While headlines about her disappearance may have faded from the national spotlight, the lessons it left behind continue to influence public perception about personal safety and missing persons awareness. Universities across the country have taken proactive steps to emphasize safety measures for students, citing cases like Lauren's as reminders of what can happen even in seemingly low-risk environments. Campus escort programs have expanded, and awareness campaigns now stress the importance of looking out for one another and reporting anything that feels out of place. As one student activist put it, "What happened to Lauren reminds us that no one is invincible. It could happen anywhere, and to anyone." Her case also brought renewed attention to systemic issues in how missing persons cases are handled, particularly those involving young adults. Advocates have used Lauren's story to highlight the need for faster response times, better communication between departments, and broader public education about what to do when someone goes missing. The lessons aren't just procedural, they're emotional, too. The anguish of Lauren's family serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of unresolved cases. For every statistic or policy reform, there is a mother, a father, a friend left in perpetual limbo, holding on to hope while grappling with the weight of unknowing. Still, as much as Lauren's case has inspired change, it remains defined by its unanswered questions. The abandoned car, the faint blood evidence, the witness descriptions of a strange-reach piece of the puzzle seemed like it should lead somewhere, but none have provided the clarity needed to solve the case. Was the driver of that car a drifter passing through town, or was it someone Lauren knew? And why, after over a decade, has no one stepped forward to fill in the gaps? These questions haunt not only Lauren's family but also the investigators who devoted countless hours to finding her. One retired officer involved in the case admitted, "You don't forget something like this. You think about the what-ifs every day." Despite these lingering doubts, those who knew Lauren choose to focus on her life as much as her loss. Friends remember her as someone who lit up every room she entered, a young woman who balanced her studies with a vibrant social life and always made time for the people she cared about. Her parents continue to fight for answers, not just for their daughter but for the countless other families facing similar heartbreak. Their resilience, in the face of so much uncertainty, is a testament to how love and grief can coexist and how justice is something worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes. Of course, there's always the possibility that new developments could emerge. Cases that seem frozen in time have been solved decades later by advances in technology, unexpected witness accounts, or breakthroughs in DNA analysis. The slightest shift in circumstances, a misplaced confession, a memory jogged, could finally bring clarity. And as Lauren's story continues to be shared, there's always hope that someone, somewhere, holds a key piece of information that will one day come to light. Until that day comes, Lauren's case remains a powerful reminder of how fragile and interconnected our lives are. It's a story about loss, but also about resilience, the resilience of a community to demand answers, of a family to keep searching, and of people everywhere to reflect on what it means to create a safer world for everyone. These are the lessons we can never forget. And most of all, it's Lauren herself who must remain at the center of it all, not just as a missing person, but as a daughter, a friend, and someone whose story continues to matter deeply. Lauren Spearer's case reminds us how rapidly the ordinary can turn into a life-altering mystery. A young woman steps out on a familiar path, and in minutes, everything changes. Her story underscores the fragility of routine, the importance of urgency, and the lasting weight unanswered questions place on families and communities. As we reflect on Lauren's disappearance, it's clear her case is not just about what was lost, but what might still remain hidden. If her story tells us anything, it's this. Even the smallest detail can bring answers. Perhaps someone out there holds the key to finding them. In late 2000, Mike Williams vanished during what should have been a simple duck hunting trip. His boat turned up, his gear was found. But Mike? Gone without a trace. What seemed like a tragic accident soon unraveled into a chilling mystery, filled with deception, betrayal, and murder. Was it nature's doing, or a calculated crime hiding in plain sight? Before we start, Please comment down below where you are watching from and what time is there right now. I will keep the screen dark so there is no light coming if you are trying to sleep. Let's get to it. Mike Williams seemed to have everything anyone could want. At just 31 years old, he had built a stable and successful life in Tallahassee, Florida. He was a rising star in real estate appraisal, working his way up the ladder through hard work and precision. His colleagues respected him, and his reputation for being both kind and driven made him someone people gravitated toward. In his personal life, Mike was equally accomplished. He had married his high school sweetheart, Denise, and together they appeared to have a happy and loving partnership. The two had a 6-month-old daughter at home, and Mike was known as a devoted father who doted on his little girl. Family and friends described him as reliable, hard-working, and deeply committed to the people he cared about. Life seemed to be progressing exactly the way Mike had planned it. One of Mike's passions, outside of his work and family, was duck hunting. It was a hobby he had cherished since his teenage years, a pursuit that allowed him some peace and escape from the demands of daily life. Over the years, he became an experienced outdoorsman, skilled at navigating the wetlands and waterways around North Florida. Hunting trips on crisp early mornings were a trusted ritual, not to mention something he loved doing alone. For Mike, these excursions weren't just a hobby, they were a time to unwind, reflect, and immerse himself in the calming rhythm of nature. December 16, 2000, was supposed to be one of those mornings. As usual, Mike had planned a solo outing to Lake Seminole, an area he knew well. The reservoir, straddling the Florida-Georgia border, was a popular spot for hunters. Its sprawling, swamp-like terrain made it rich in wildlife, but also challenging to navigate for anyone unfamiliar with its vastness. It wasn't Mike's first trip to the lake, and it likely wouldn't have been his last. Denise later told investigators that Mike had planned to be home by noon so they could celebrate their 6th wedding anniversary. That Saturday would mark more than half a decade of marriage, a milestone worth celebrating. But Mike never came home. By the time Denise realized something was wrong, it was already late afternoon. Frantic, she called her father, who then contacted a close family friend, Brian Winchester. Together, they began searching for Mike, eventually involving law enforcement once initial efforts proved unsuccessful. The first clue surfaced when his Ford Bronco was found parked near the lake, an ordinary sight for someone preparing to head out on the water. However, what became increasingly strange was that there wasn't any sign of Mike himself. The search expanded rapidly. Investigators deployed divers, boats, and specialized search equipment to comb Lake Seminole in hopes of locating either Mike or signs of what may have happened to him. Hours turned into days, and still, the search came up empty. On December 20, after nearly a week of intensive efforts, officials recovered Mike's hunting boat bobbing on the water. It appeared undamaged. Inside, they found a handful of his personal belongings, a shotgun, some decoys, and his beloved waders, the heavy, waterproof overalls duck hunters often wear. At first glance, the scene suggested a tragic but potentially simple explanation. The prevailing theory was that Mike had fallen overboard, weighed down by his gear, and drowned. Duck hunting is not without its risks, and Lake Seminole is known for its strong vegetation and difficult to navigate conditions. Accidents happen, even to skilled hunters. In December, when water temperatures are low, hypothermia can quickly set in for anyone submerged for too long. For authorities, the idea of an accidental drowning made sense. Extensive debris and dense grasses could have concealed his body, making recovery more difficult. Moreover, the lake was home to several large alligators, another factor officials thought could explain why no trace of Mike had yet been found. However, doubts began to creep in as the days stretched into weeks without answers. Even in lakes as expansive as Seminole, human remains are almost always recovered during a search of this magnitude. Specialists in water rescues noted that bodies in freshwater environments tend to float to the surface within days due to natural buoyancy. Yet there was nothing, no new signs of Mike, no physical evidence to suggest what had actually happened. Lending to the growing unease was the level of effort being poured into the search. By all accounts, the response to Mike's disappearance was exhaustive. Teams of trained divers methodically searched underwater areas known to trap debris or obstruct visibility. Helicopters and boats with sonar technology scanned wide stretches of the lake from above and below. Volunteer rescue squads covered shorelines, combing through marshes and overgrowth inch by inch. Friends and family members of Mike watched helplessly from the sidelines, frustrated as each day passed without progress. People who had lived in the area for decades commented on how rare it was for a body to not be recovered under such circumstances. "That lake gives up its dead," one searcher reportedly said at the time. This lack of resolution struck an unusual chord with Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother. Cheryl never accepted the idea that her son's death was simply a hunting accident gone awry. To her, the Mike she knew, a careful, responsible man, wouldn't have made a mistake that cost him his life. He was meticulous by nature, someone who valued planning and preparation. He always wore his life jacket when he hunted, and he knew the waters of Lake Seminole well enough to avoid common hazards. To Cheryl, the narrative that Mike had drowned and been consumed by alligators felt more like a convenient explanation than the actual truth. Other elements of the case also didn't sit right. Mike was known to be a strong swimmer, someone who could handle himself in the water even under difficult conditions. His waders, though cumbersome, weren't torn or damaged when found, something one would expect if they had been dislodged while he struggled in the lake. More importantly, why hadn't his body surfaced? Forensic experts had pointed out during the investigation that alligator activity in December was typically minimal. The reptiles are cold-blooded, which means they tend to slow down in cooler weather, entering periods of low activity that make it unlikely they would aggressively feed or attack. So questions began piling up, and answers remained elusive. While many in the community leaned toward believing Mike's death was simply an unfortunate accident, doubts continued to simmer just beneath the surface. The combination of incomplete evidence, unusual circumstances, and Cheryl's growing insistence that something wasn't right left law enforcement with a mystery they couldn't fully resolve. The case remained stagnant, filled with speculation, but largely without any definitive proof to suggest foul play or exonerate it. By the time 2001 rolled around, both the official investigation and the volunteer search efforts began to wind down. With Mike still missing, authorities had little choice but to treat his disappearance as an accidental drowning. There was no body to rule otherwise, and without a witness or a confession, their hands were tied. Denise, left grieving the loss of her husband, made moves to settle his affairs and work toward a semblance of normalcy for their child. Friends and loved ones expressed sympathy, doing what they could to support her during what appeared to be a tragic chapter in her life. But in the quiet weeks and months that followed, more whispers of doubt circulated. Could there have been something sinister lurking behind the narrative of an accident? Cheryl Williams certainly thought so, and her quest to uncover the truth was just beginning. The question remained, how could a man like Mike Williams, in the prime of his life, vanish completely without leaving a shred of hard evidence behind? At this point, it seemed the story of Mike's life ended on Lake Seminole. Yet, someone, somewhere, likely knew exactly what had happened that day. The theory that alligators might have consumed Mike Williams's body emerged early in the investigation, becoming one of the primary explanations for why no remains were recovered from Lake Seminole. For investigators, it seemed like a plausible scenario at first. Lake Seminole is a sprawling reservoir on the Florida-Georgia border, known for its murky water, dense vegetation, and abundant wildlife, including its population of alligators. When Mike's truck and boat were found but his body was not, the idea that the lake's predators had played a role fit well with the initial narrative of an accidental drowning. It was a neat explanation, wrapping a complex situation into something easily understood. A man fell into the water, drowned, and then disappeared into the ecosystem. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, FFWCC, officials focused their early efforts on recovering what they could from the lake. But after weeks of intense searching, hope began to fade, and speculation about the role of alligators became louder. A private search firm even floated the suggestion that alligators could have dismembered and stored portions of Mike's body underwater, a macabre survival behavior sometimes observed in alligator feeding patterns. Without tangible answers, this theory gained traction among law enforcement and the public alike. It seemed to explain why the lake had given up none of Mike's remains, no clothing fragments, no hard tissue, no signs he had ever been there, aside from his abandoned boat. At first, this explanation felt comforting to some. Alligators, after all, were an ever-present danger in Florida's waterways, and the water around Lake Seminole was no exception. Many residents in the area, accustomed to the creature's presence, found the theory reasonable. But as experts began to weigh in, cracks in the idea quickly emerged. Cold weather ended up being one of the most glaring inconsistencies. Herpetologist Matt Oresco, who had studied alligator behavior extensively, pointed out that alligators are cold-blooded animals, meaning their activity slows significantly in colder temperatures. During the winter months, particularly when water temperatures drop below 55 degrees F. Alligators reduce their movements and cease hunting. At the time of Mike's disappearance, daytime temperatures hovered around 55 degrees Celsius, with overnight lows dropping into the freezing range. The lake's waters were recorded at around 46 degrees F, well within the range that makes alligators sluggish, dormant, and uninterested in feeding. Oresco's conclusions challenged the core of the alligator theory directly. For alligators to have swarmed and entirely consumed a human body in these conditions would have been extraordinarily rare, virtually unheard of, in fact. Feeding under these circumstances would go against their typical winter habits, when survival depends more on conserving energy than on the active pursuit of food. To put it simply, it was hard to envision the slow-moving reptiles aggressively devouring Mike Williams in the cold December waters of Lake Seminole. The condition of the items recovered from the lake also added to the growing skepticism. Approximately 6 months after his disappearance, searchers found Mike's waders, a hunting jacket, and a flashlight. For a case that many assumed involved alligators, these items told a conflicting story. A forensic examination of the waders revealed no tears, punctures, or bite marks, evidence that would almost certainly be present if large predators had attacked someone wearing them. What's more, the flashlight was still functional when turned on, and both the jacket and waders showed fewer signs of decomposition than expected for objects submerged for half a year. These findings cast doubt on whether Mike's body, or any part of it, had been exposed to the natural forces thought to have caused his disappearance. Compounding the doubts was a small but significant detail about Mike's habits on the water. A close friend who frequently hunted with Mike told investigators that Mike took safety seriously, to the point where he followed a meticulous routine every time he set out. For instance, he would never wear his waders while driving his boat. Experienced duck hunters like Mike knew that wearing waders in a moving boat could be dangerous. If someone were to fall overboard, the waterlogged material could drag them down or restrict their movement. Mike, being cautious by nature, avoided that risk. So why then would his waders have turned up in the investigation? If Mike wasn't prone to unnecessary risks, why would he have changed his routine on that particular day? These small but significant details painted a picture that didn't align with the alligator theory or even the accidental drowning explanation more broadly. One by one, the assumptions that had built up around Mike's disappearance started to fall apart. The cold water, the condition of recovered items, and Mike's well-known habits all suggested that something else entirely might have happened. For Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother, these inconsistencies validated her doubts. She had never believed that alligators had consumed her son or that he had drowned at all. To her, the unwillingness to challenge this theory signaled something more concerning, an effort to close the case too quickly without asking the right questions. If alligators weren't involved, then what had kept a body from being recovered? Why hadn't Mike's remains surfaced when, in most freshwater cases, natural buoyancy brings victims back to the surface within a matter of days? Why did his equipment seem so undisturbed, as though it had been placed, not lost? If Lake Seminole wasn't hiding the answers, might the truth lie somewhere else entirely? By mid-2001, the narrative was shifting. The alligator theory had been weakened to the point where it no longer carried much weight in the investigation. Among experts and skeptics alike, a new question emerged. Had someone used the lake itself as a cover? At first glance, Mike Williams' disappearance might have looked like an accident. But now, it seemed less and less like a tragic mistake and more like a deliberate act. Authorities began to wrestle with possibilities they hadn't initially considered. Could the lake have been staged as part of a larger plan? And if so, who would have had the motive and the opportunity to make Mike Williams vanish? The details surrounding Mike Williams' disappearance just didn't add up. A boat with its engine turned off, a full gas tank, and unscathed hunting gear shouldn't have been part of a drowning narrative knot if the accident unfolded the way investigators initially theorized. But these were exactly the conditions of Mike's belongings when they were found. Each piece of evidence raised new questions, piecing together an unusual and unsettling picture. Let's go back to where it all began. Mike's boat, discovered 4 days after he vanished, roughly 225 feet from the nearest boat ramp. It appeared eerily intact. The engine wasn't idling or even damage at it was completely off. According to the initial theory, Mike had supposedly fallen out after colliding with one of Lake Seminole's many partially submerged tree stumps, which are known hazards for boaters in the area. But there was one glaring problem with this explanation. A representative from the boat manufacturer later confirmed that if Mike had fallen out while the engine was on, it would have continued running, causing the boat to circle aimlessly until the fuel ran out. Instead, the gas tank was full, as though the boat hadn't been in use at all. Why was the engine off, and why did it look like the boat had been deliberately anchored in place? Even its location didn't make sense. At the time of Mike's disappearance, weather in the area included strong westerly winds caused by a storm that swept through. If the boat had been left unmoored and floating, those winds should have pushed it eastward toward the Georgia side of the lake. Instead, it remained close to the Florida boat ramp, where Mike's truck and trailer had been parked. It was as if the boat hadn't drifted much at all, challenging the idea that it had been floating freely after a random accident. Was it simply an anomaly? Or could it suggest the boat was intentionally staged to sell the appearance of an accident? Inside the boat, investigators found more puzzling clues. Mike's shotgun, carefully stored in its case, was lying undisturbed. Duck hunters take their shotguns out as soon as they're out on the water, prepared to hunt at a moment's notice, especially at prime times of day. Mike was a meticulous, experienced outdoorsman. Carrying a cased shotgun while already on the lake wasn't his routine. His hunting license and boyhood experience in these very waters meant he didn't leave things to chance, especially with gear essential to his trips. If Mike had planned to start hunting that morning, why was the shotgun still secured? The condition of Mike's belongings, found months later, added even more questions. The waders were one of the standout discoveries. Heavy and cumbersome, waders are specifically designed to protect the legs and lower body from water, and they're a staple for duck hunters. These were found undamaged and remarkably pristine, showing no signs of having been submerged and decayed in the dark, muddy depths of the lake for 6 months. In fact, they floated on the surface when finally discovered a sharp contradiction to the initial drowning theory. A forensic analysis confirmed there were no tears, punctures, or deterioration that might indicate exposure to rough waters, debris, or predators. Then there was the flashlight. Recovered with the other items, it was still functional when investigators switched it on. The light came back to life with a simple twist of the switch, totally at odds with the idea that it had spent months under layers of sediment and aquatic plant life. Batteries corrode quickly in humid, submerged conditions, but this one seemed untouched by its supposed ordeal. That single beam of working light contradicted the official claims of long-term immersion. Equally dubious was Mike's hunting jacket, which exhibited minimal signs of environmental wear or decay. Together, the condition of the recovered gear signaled something investigators couldn't ignore. These items may not have been lost during an accident at all. Were they ever submerged for months, or were they strategically placed in the lake long after Mike vanished? Mike's personal habits only deepened the mystery. Witnesses who had hunted with Mike over the years described him as extremely cautious, almost methodical in his approach to water safety. This was not a man prone to risks. One notable habit stood out. Mike refused to wear his waders while driving his boat. The added weight, combined with their restrictive fit, made falling into the water while wearing them a near-certain death sentence. Instead, Mike always waited to put them on after the boat was docked or anchored, once he was prepared to begin hunting. So why would he have been wearing them on the boat that day, as officials implied? This single detail ran counter to everything Mike's friends knew about his personality and habits. It was hard to reconcile this particular point with the accident theory. If Mike was always this careful, how could something as dangerous and preventable as falling into the water with waders have happened to him? Then there was the troubling issue of where Mike had launched his boat. His truck was discovered parked near a simple, undeveloped launch site here, far cry from the polished concrete ramps he preferred. Mike liked efficiency and ease, and he generally avoided the rougher areas, the ones that required extra effort to get his boat in and out of the water. This choice of launch stood out as uncharacteristic. Why would Mike use a less finished area he rarely turned to for his routine outings? More importantly, did Mike even launch the boat from this ramp at all, or had his truck been parked there by someone else to throw off investigators? The discovery of Mike's items and boat reopened critical questions with each passing development. Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother, grew more vocal in her disbelief of the official reasoning. Even while the file labeled Mike's case a tragic accident, she refused to accept it. To her, the inconsistencies surrounding the evidence painted a different picture, one that investigators still hadn't fully acknowledged, and as details came to light, other red flags began to rise. One of the most damning problems of the investigation was its handling in the early hours and days after Mike's disappearance. Investigators failed to secure the boat as a potential crime scene. It was soon returned to Mike's family, as though there were no need to preserve it for further examination. The same occurred with his truck. The area surrounding the boat ramp was never treated as a proper investigative site. In addition, the storm that rolled through after Mike vanished brought dozens of volunteers and curious onlookers to the scene. As efforts to find Mike intensified, the crowds inadvertently compromised any chance of collecting reliable forensic evidence from the area. These accumulated details began to gnaw at anyone paying close attention to the case. Mike's pristine waders, the floating boat with a full gas tank and an engine switched off it was all too strange to accept without more critical analysis. The unsecured scene made it difficult to know whether the original clues even reflected the truth of what had happened that day. It no longer felt like the lake was the only thing keeping the mystery of Mike Williams from being solved. It was starting to feel like someone had gone to great lengths to ensure questions outnumbered answers. With no body and no solid explanation, what had first looked like a tragic accident was starting to feel completely different. If Mike hadn't drowned accidentally in Lake Seminole, then what did happen? And if someone staged the boat, the gear, or even the truck, why would they go to such trouble? Each of these discrepancies brought the investigation one step closer to a possibility more chilling than any alligator-infested marsh. What if Mike Williams' disappearance hadn't been an accident at all? What if someone had planned this? As unsettling as these questions were, more disturbing answers began to surface. Investigators and those closest to Mike started to see threads pointing away from Lake Seminole and toward Mike's personal life, a life that, beneath the surface, wasn't as picture-perfect as it seemed. Denise Williams appears, at first glance, to be a grieving widow. Her husband, Mike, had disappeared under tragic and mysterious circumstances, leaving Denise behind to raise their 6-month-old daughter alone. And for a time, the tragedy seemed to fit neatly into place: a tragic drowning on a cold December morning, an unfortunate accident that left a hole in the lives of his loved ones. But just beneath the surface, there were details about Denise's life that would soon raise questions about her relationships, questions about money, and, eventually, questions about whether Mike's disappearance was an accidenta, something much darker. Not long after Mike's disappearance, one specific piece of information came to light that started to change how some people viewed Denise's role in the case. In the months leading up to Mike's disappearance, Brian Winchester, a family friend, had facilitated the purchase of a substantial life insurance policy on Mike. This was a significant policy, with a payout of $1 million, an amount large enough to support a surviving family after an unexpected tragedy. On the surface, this kind of planning wasn't unusual. Mike was a responsible man, a careful planner who prioritized his family's financial well-being. It wasn't hard to believe that he would take steps to ensure Denise and their baby would be protected if something happened to him. But as more details about the insurance policy emerged, its timing and circumstances caught the attention of investigators. Brian Winchester wasn't just a casual acquaintance of the Williams family, he was deeply intertwined in their lives. The two men had been close friends for years, part of a small, tight-knit group of friends and family that often socialized together. Brian had been trusted enough to handle the life insurance arrangements, which made sense given that he worked in the financial services industry. He appeared to be someone Mike relied on, a friend who could be counted on to help navigate the sometimes complicated details of life insurance policies. But what didn't make sense, at least not to Cheryl Williams and eventually to investigators, was just how quickly things seemed to fall into place for Brian and Denise after Mike's disappearance. In the years that followed, the friendship between Denise and Brian began evolving into something more. In 2005, just 5 years after Mike had vanished, the two married. For many, this raised eyebrows. Cheryl Williams, in particular, viewed the relationship between Denise and Brian with suspicion. She had already been outspoken in her belief that Mike's death was not an accident, and the timing of this new marriage only deepened her doubts. Denise and Brian, now living together as a married couple, continued to raise Mike and Denise's daughter in the same house where Denise had lived with Mike. It was a blending of lives that, to some, appeared far too convenient. Adding to Cheryl's suspicions was the financial windfall that Denise had received following Mike's disappearance. After her husband was declared legally dead, Denise had collected the full $1 million life insurance payout. This payout, coupled with her remarriage to Brian, raised questions among those already uneasy about the circumstances of Mike's disappearance. Cheryl frequently pointed out that Denise's financial stability and apparent ability to move forward with her life stood in sharp contrast to the devastation many expected from a grieving widow. To Cheryl, it felt like Denise and Brian had not just accepted Mike's death but had benefited from it in ways that were difficult to ignore. For investigators, the connection between the life insurance payout and Denise's remarriage to Brian prompted closer scrutiny. They began to revisit the details surrounding the policy itself, focusing on its timing and the role Brian had played in setting it up. Taking out life insurance isn't uncommon, but what stood out in this case was how recently the policy had been purchased before Mike's disappearance. Brian Winchester had played an active role in encouraging Mike and Denise to secure the policy. His expertise in financial planning often meant friends and family trusted his advice on these matters. But had this specific policy been too conveniently timed? For Cheryl Williams, the connections felt almost too calculated to be coincidence. She pointed to the insurance payout, the new marriage, and Brian's central role in both as evidence that her son's disappearance was no accident. In her mind, there were clear motives for foul play. Mike was the obstacle, and his death had cleared the way for both financial gain and a life together for Denise and Brian. Her relentless lobbying of law enforcement to reopen Mike's case became all the more intense as these suspicions bubbled to the surface. Still, authorities hesitated to act. The case remained cold for years after Mike was declared legally dead. Without a body or solid evidence of foul play, there wasn't much to prove that animosity or a crime existed. While the connection between Denise and Brian raised questions publicly, it wasn't enough to bring any official charges. The fact that someone benefited financially from a life insurance policy didn't automatically make them a suspect. In the eyes of the law, lifting suspicions to the level of definitive proof required more than public discomfort. The timeline of Denise and Brian's relationship, however, became increasingly difficult for investigators to overlook. Cheryl's persistence kept the case alive in the public sphere, and little by little, former acquaintances of the couple began to come forward with observations that suggested their connection had developed well before Mike's disappearance. Early hints of affection between the two reportedly existed within social circles prior to December. 2,000 details that added more fuel to Cheryl's belief that this wasn't simply two people leaning on each other during a shared loss. Were Denise and Brian romantically involved before Mike disappeared? If so, it added a new layer to the investigation surrounding Mike's supposed accident at Lake Seminole. In hindsight, Cheryl viewed her son's death as the starting point for Denise and Brian's life together. Although Denise was publicly quiet about Mike's death, Cheryl believed her actions spoke volumes. Cheryl often raised the question with investigators, how could someone move on so quickly, so smoothly, without a deeper reason? The financial windfall from that life insurance policy and the publicity that followed their eventual marriage put Denise and Brian in an uncomfortable spotlight. And while they attempted to portray a new life of normalcy, the whispers of those who knew them began to shift the tone of the narrative. Despite Cheryl's relentless efforts, law enforcement was slow to act. For years, the story of Mike's disappearance stayed frozen in place, untouched by new evidence or significant breakthroughs. Investigators knew something didn't align perfectly with an accidental drowning, but they lacked the hard evidence needed to fully pursue another line of inquiry. Denise and Brian's marriage fueled suspicion, but wasn't proof of any wrongdoing. The insurance payout seemed ill-timed, but, on its own, wasn't enough to unwind the complicated web of relationships. There were no eyewitnesses, no physical evidence, and no clear motive, at least in legal terms. What Cheryl didn't realize during those years of frustration and waiting was that the facade of Denise and Brian's life together was already beginning to crack. Behind closed doors, their relationship was far from the perfect partnership it appeared to be. Trouble between the two would eventually lead to desperate actions on Brian Winchester's part acts that, years later, would break open the case and shed light on the truth behind Mike Williams' disappearance. By the early 2000s, Cheryl could feel momentum building, even if progress felt slow. Over time, public pressure began to mount, and with each media appearance Cheryl made, she refused to let her son's story fade from memory. Her accusations against Brian and Denise grew sharper, louder, and more pointed as she became convinced Mike had met with foul play. Authorities eventually reopened the case in 2004, largely due to Cheryl's tireless advocacy. But as investigators took a second look, they would come to see just how tangled the story of Denise, Brian, and Mike really was. And while this chapter of the case focused on the beginnings of suspicion, the truth was only just starting to surface. It would take years and an act of desperation by Brian Winchester before the full scope of what happened to Mike Williams came to light. Cheryl Williams couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong from the moment she heard the explanation of her son's disappearance. A presumed drowning accident in the murky waters of Lake Seminole was unconvinced. The idea that Mike, a cautious outdoorsman and strong swimmer, could slip beneath the surface without a trace and somehow not resurface never sat right with her. Then there was the fact that experienced searchers, equipped with sonar and dive teams, hadn't found a single piece of conclusive evidence to support a drowning. For Cheryl, The lack of answers wasn't evidence that Mike's death was an accident. It was evidence that something was being missed or hidden. While others moved on, Cheryl refused to let the matter rest. What followed was a years-long campaign, fueled by a mother's intuition and an unrelenting desire to know the truth. Cheryl's fight for answers began in 2000, in the immediate aftermath of Mike's disappearance. At first, like anyone in her position, she hoped for a quick resolution, but as days turned into weeks and still no body was recovered, her hope turned to frustration. The lack of physical evidence, the inconsistencies in the theories, and the neatly tied-up conclusion of an accidental drowning felt premature, worse, wrong. With few allies and even fewer resources, Cheryl launched her own efforts to uncover what had really happened to her son. She began reaching out to local authorities, questioning every detail she could about the investigation. She wanted to know why the search had turned up empty and why law enforcement seemed so willing to close the case after only a few weeks of searching. Her questions often fell on deaf ears. Cheryl was met with resistance, sometimes outright dismissal from the agencies involved in the early stages of the investigation. One problem, it seemed, was the lack of clear-cut evidence pointing to foul play. Without a crime scene, a motive, or even a body, law enforcement saw no justification to treat Mike's disappearance as anything but a tragic accident. Cheryl's concerns were often brushed aside, and she found herself fighting not just to prove her point but to have it heard at all. Faced with official indifference, Cheryl decided to take matters into her own hands. She turned to her community, hoping to keep Mike's case in the public eye. Cheryl used local newspapers to her advantage, purchasing ads that asked for information and encouraged anyone with knowledge of the disappearance to come forward. She was strategic, knowing that the more attention she could draw to her son's story, the harder it would be for authorities to ignore. Billboards soon went up near high-traffic areas, reminding everyone in the region that Mike Williams was still missing and that his mother wasn't giving up. In Cheryl's mind, forgetting was not an option. But Cheryl didn't stop with public appeals. She also approached state officials, writing letters to explain her concerns and demand further action. Her persistence was staggering. She reportedly wrote a letter to Florida Governor Rick Scott every single day for months, asking him to assign the case to another agency or appoint a special prosecutor. In total, she sent more than 200 letters, yet they went unanswered. The silence from top officials only fueled Cheryl's anger. She believed the system was failing her son, and she was determined to make sure that wouldn't happen. By 2004, these efforts finally started to make a dent. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, agreed to revisit the case nearly 4 years after Mike disappeared. For Cheryl, this small breakthrough was proof that persistence worked. But getting the case reopened was just one step. The real battle would be whether anyone could find the evidence to crack it open. Cheryl continued to push, refusing to let momentum stall. She kept speaking out, emphasizing the inconsistencies in Mike's case, and making it clear she had no plans to quit until she had answers. Throughout this time, Cheryl faced significant challenges. Her unwavering belief that Mike had not drowned wasn't always met with sympathy or support. Friends, neighbors, and even some family members began to question why she couldn't let go. People criticized her for holding on to what they saw as false hope, insisting that Mike's death was simply a tragedy, not a mystery. But Cheryl didn't back down. She famously told reporters in 2007, "I get criticized a lot for not admitting that Mike's dead. All I know is I can't stop looking for him until I find him." To her, the unanswered questions weren't just an obstacle, they were a sign that someone wasn't telling the truth. Cheryl's determination extended to the media as well. In 2012, Mike's story was featured on an episode of Disappeared, a popular true crime series on investigation discovery. Cheryl played a key role in ensuring the show featured the case, knowing that national attention could apply a fresh kind of pressure to those involved. The episode brought Mike's story to a wider audience, renewing interest in the bizarre circumstances of his disappearance. In every interview she gave about the case, Cheryl reiterated her belief that her son had not drowned. She never hesitated to criticize law enforcement for their lack of action and slow response in the early days of the investigation. Her persistence made sure the case remained active in the public's mind and impossible for officials to completely ignore. Behind the scenes, Cheryl continued to explore every lead she could. She engaged with anyone she thought might have information, no matter how small. People from Mike's past, strangers in Tallahassee's tight-knit community, anyone who crossed Cheryl's path might find themselves drawn into her search for the truth. Sometimes the trail led to dead ends, but Cheryl was undeterred. What kept her going, she often said, was her love for her son. She couldn't accept a life where there wasn't justice for Mikey, or worse, a life where the truth never surfaced at all. While Cheryl's efforts focused on keeping the investigation alive, she couldn't ignore the other strange developments happening around her. Denise Williams and Brian Winchester's marriage in 2005 hadn't gone unnoticed. Cheryl had publicly expressed her suspicions about the life insurance policy and its potentially suspicious timing, but now she found herself raising questions about Denise and Brian's personal lives too. To Cheryl, the marriage was more than just a coincidence, it was a motive. She believed that Mike's death might have paved the way for Denise and Brian's life together, along with the financial security Denise gained through the insurance payout. Cheryl didn't shy away from implying that the couple knew far more about Mike's disappearance than they'd ever admitted. Still, for years, her suspicions didn't move the needle far enough to shift the investigation forward. The FDLE's re-examination of the case in 2004 didn't result in any arrests or new evidence being found. But crucially, it did keep the focus from fading entirely. Cheryl's persistence acted as a safeguard, ensuring that Mike's case wasn't relegated to a forgotten file in some corner of law enforcement archives. It may not have provided immediate answers, but it kept attention on the oddities and contradictions that surrounded Mike's disappearance. This would prove critical in later years when new evidence finally came to light. Cheryl's dedication stands out not only because of what she achieved, but also because of how long it took. The fight for justice spanned more than a decade. And at every turn, Cheryl encountered obstacles that might have caused anyone else to stop. But quitting was never an option. For Cheryl, advocating for her son wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about giving him the dignity he deserved, even in death. What Cheryl couldn't know at the time was that the answers she'd sought for so long were closer than anyone realized. Behind closed doors, cracks were forming in Denise and Brian's relationship. Those cracks would widen over the years, ultimately leading to a series of events that, quite unexpectedly, provided the break the case had been waiting for. Cheryl's tireless fight had kept the investigation alive long enough for those cracks to appear. The stage was set for a confession that would finally confirm what Cheryl had suspected all along. Mike's death wasn't an accident. It was a murder. In August 2016, the disappearance of Mike Williams, which had baffled investigators and haunted his mother Cheryl for 16 years, took an unexpected turn. Brian Winchester, the man who had married Mike's widow, Denise, was arrested not for anything directly related to Mike, but for a crime no one had seen coming. Winchester had kidnapped Denise at gunpoint. The details were startling. On her way to work at Florida State University that morning, Denise found Brian waiting for her. Armed and agitated, he climbed into her car and held her hostage. It was a brazen and desperate act, one that puzzled even those close to the case. But while the kidnapping itself seemed unrelated to Mike's disappearance, it soon became the thread that would unravel years of secrets. At the time, Denise and Brian had been going through a contentious divorce. Their relationship, which had seemed deliberately built on the foundations of Mike's absence, had grown increasingly strained over the years. In court filings, Denise said she had feared Brian's behavior was becoming erratic. It wasn't just about their failing marriage, there were hints of paranoia and desperation in his actions, and when he kidnapped her, those fears were painfully validated. Authorities charged Brian with multiple crimes, including armed burglary, domestic assault, and kidnapping, all of which underscored the severity of the situation. Brian was held without bond, as both prosecutors and the courts deemed him a significant threat. For Denise, who sought immediate protection orders against him, the incident was terrifying. But for investigators, it was a bizarre opportunity. Brian's arrest gave law enforcement the opening they'd been waiting for. His erratic behavior during the kidnapping and the circumstances of his unraveling domestic life raised new questions about his past and his possible involvement in Mike Williams' disappearance. Brian was no longer just Denise's second husband or a once-trusted family friend. He was now a key figure under the microscope, someone whose story demanded to be revisited. The arrest came with one critical advantage: pressure. Facing decades in prison, Brian now had something to lose. And, after years of silence, investigators suspected he might be willing to talk not just about the kidnapping, but about what had happened to Mike back in 2000. Initially, Brian denied any involvement. His defense team downplayed any connection between the disappearance and his legal troubles, framing the kidnapping as a moment of poor judgment during an emotionally charged time. But behind the scenes, investigators weren't buying it. The timing of the life insurance payout, the quick marriage to Denise, and now this act of desperation, everything pointed to a deeper story Brian wasn't telling. By 2017, As Brian's legal battles over the kidnapping played out, negotiations quietly took shape. Authorities suspected Brian knew where Mike's body was, and they were determined to get it out of him. Around this time, prosecutors seemed willing to strike a deal. They couldn't erase the charges tied to the kidnapping, but they hinted at a lighter sentence in exchange for crucial information about Mike's disappearance. For Brian, this was a lifeline in an otherwise bleak reality. He began cooperating, and in early October of that year, he gave investigators the one thing they had been chasing for over a decade: the location of Mike Williams' body. The site Brian described was a muddy patch of land at the end of Gardner Road in northern Leon County, Florida. It was roughly 5 miles from where Mike had grown up, a place with haunting proximity to the life he had built and ultimately lost. In the weeks that followed, a team of county workers, search dogs, and investigators began excavating the area. They worked for 5 days, meticulously digging through the dense, wet soil to uncover exactly what Brian had described. Finally, after years of dead ends and false starts, there was a breakthrough. Human remains were recovered from the scene. They were sent for forensic testing, and not long after, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement confirmed the results. The remains belonged to Mike Williams. The confirmation marked the case's most significant development since Mike had disappeared 16 years earlier. DNA testing, matched against a sample provided by Cheryl Williams, left no doubt. Mike hadn't drowned in Lake Seminole. He hadn't been consumed by alligators or lost to the elements in a tragic accident. He had been murdered. The initial theories that had dogged the investigation for so long were now conclusively disproved. Cheryl Williams' years of fighting, lobbying, and pushing for answers had finally been validated. Her son had fallen victim to something far more sinister than anyone had imagined in those early days after his disappearance. What made the location even more haunting was its personal connection to Mike. The site where his body was buried was intimate and deliberate, hidden in plain sight yet close to home. It wasn't some remote swamp or anonymous burial ground. Instead, it was a pocket of land familiar to Brian Winchester. This wasn't a random act, investigators realized. It was calculated. It also spoke to the sheer audacity of whoever had left Mike there, possibly believing no one would ever look or suspect foul play. But now the body had been found, setting the stage for more revelations. The details weren't made public immediately, and this was a deliberate choice by investigators. The cause of death and specific evidence recovered from the site were kept confidential. The goal was to ensure that any forthcoming details, particularly those from potential suspects, would line up with facts only the involved parties could know. By controlling the flow of information, law enforcement positioned themselves to build a stronger case, one less vulnerable to misinterpretation or leaks. But for Cheryl and her supporters, the discovery of Mike's remains had already provided one critical piece of closure: confirmation that her instincts about her son's fate had been right all along. Brian's confession and Mike's discovery also reopened long-standing questions about Denise's role in everything that had transpired. For years, Cheryl had speculated about whether Denise was more involved than she let on. Would Brian's cooperation implicate Denise further? Investigators, already circling around her inconsistencies, now had more to work with. And as more details about Mike's murder emerged, Denise would soon find herself in the spotlight in ways she had fought to avoid. Ultimately, Brian's arrest for the kidnapping of Denise Williams became a turning point investigators had never anticipated. What began as the unraveling of a toxic, crumbling marriage revealed far more than Denise and Brian had likely ever intended. Mike Williams, who for years seemed like the victim of a tragic accident, was finally vindicated as the victim of a calculated crime. His remains, recovered and positively identified, told a story no one could ignore. But if Brian's confession confirmed one thing, it raised another unsettling question. What had really happened on Lake Seminole that day in December 2000? What role had Denise played, if any? And what motivations had turned a trusted best friend and a loving wife into suspects in a murder case? The discovery of Mike's body wasn't just a resolution, it was the start of a new phase in the investigation. Now, investigators had the proof they needed to begin asking harder questions. And as they turned to the circumstances of Mike's death, Brian's confession would reveal nearly unthinkable details about betrayal, deceit, and the length some people will go to for love, money, and a life free of obstacles. But for Cheryl, it was the moment she had been fighting for all along. Her son didn't drown. He didn't simply vanish. Someone had taken him, buried him, and stolen his life. The truth behind Mike Williams' disappearance was chilling. For years, His death had looked like a tragic accident. But in 2017, Brian Winchester revealed a story no one had imagined. It was a crime that had been set in motion months before that December morning, in 2000, carefully plotted and executed by two people Mike trusted most: his wife, Denise, and his best friend, Brian. The details, according to Brian's confession, exposed a murder wrapped in betrayal, greed, and manipulation. This was not an accident, it was a calculated plan to eliminate Mike and make his death look like one. It started, Brian claimed, as an idea born out of his and Denise's ongoing affair. The relationship between Denise and Brian hadn't been a fleeting lapse in judgment. It began in 1997, 3 years before Mike's disappearance, while both were still married to their respective spouses. Over time, the affair grew more serious. Brian testified that their initial plans were to leave their spouses, but the logistics seemed too complicated. They worried about how a divorce, particularly Denise's, might impact their lives. Denise, according to Brian, didn't want to deal with the financial fallout, custody issues, or the social consequences of ending her marriage to Mike. Their solution was as twisted as it was clear: get rid of Mike. The plot officially began in early 2000, 9 months before Mike's disappearance. Denise and Brian discussed several potential scenarios to make Mike's death look like an accident. The first plan involved a boating trip to the Gulf of Mexico, where Brian would stage a fatal mishap. But according to Brian, they ultimately abandoned this idea because it seemed too risky, too complicated. Instead, they shifted their focus to a hunting trip on Lake Seminole, a setting that gave them the advantage of isolation and plausible danger. They believed the lake would provide the perfect cover if Mike drowned. No one would question it. The story would write itself. On the morning of December 16, 2000, Brian put the plan into motion. He convinced Mike to go duck hunting at Lake Seminole, just as they had done many times before. To Mike, it was another routine outing, but to Brian, it was the culmination of months of preparation and deceit. The two friends launched the boat into the water just before dawn, under the pretense of looking for prime hunting spots. As they moved further out into the lake, Brian urged Mike to put on his waders, a decision that would later prove significant. Brian's account of what happened next revealed a sequence of events that would alter lives forever. As they reached a secluded area of the lake, Brian deliberately pushed Mike out of the boat. The cold, murky water immediately swallowed Mike, and his heavy waders made it almost impossible for him to tread water. But despite the plan's careful design, Mike didn't immediately drown. He managed to grab onto a nearby tree stump, holding himself above water and fighting to survive. At this point, the facade of accident began to fall apart. What was supposed to be a quick and undetectable death turned into something much messier. As Mike clung to the stump, Brian realized he had no other option but to finish what he'd started. He retrieved his shotgun, stepped closer to the edge of the boat, and fired a single shot. The blast hit Mike in the face, killing him instantly. The betrayal Mike must have felt in those final moments, looking up at the person he'd once considered a lifelong friend, was unimaginable. Brian's confession left little doubt about the deliberate and calculated nature of this act. There was no hesitation in his account. What followed only underscored the lengths he and Denise were willing to go to cover their tracks. After killing Mike, Brian transported his body back to shore. He had already chosen a site to dispose of a muddy area near Gardner Road, relatively close to where Mike had grown up. There, Brian buried Mike's remains in a shallow grave, covering them with debris to make the spot as inconspicuous as possible. The next step in the plan was just as unsettling as the murder itself, going back to their everyday lives as if nothing had happened. For Denise and Brian, the goal wasn't just to avoid suspicion, it was to erase Mike entirely. That same evening, Brian attended a family Christmas party as planned. He arrived on time, acted normal, and avoided behaviors that might raise questions. Denise, back at home with their infant daughter, played her role as the concerned wife without hesitation. For a time, the plan appeared to work. Investigators initially treated Mike's disappearance as an accident, and within weeks, Denise began the process of cashing in on the $1 million life insurance policy that Brian had helped her secure. The depth of their betrayal went far beyond the murder itself. For Mike, the plot was carried out by the two people he trusted above all else. Denise was his high school sweetheart, the mother of his child, the person he had built his entire adult life around. Brian, meanwhile, had been his closest friend for years, someone who knew every corner of Mike's life. For them, though, Mike was just an obstacle that needed to be removed so they could be together. The fact that their affair had fueled and justified such an elaborate crime spoke to the extent of their cold calculations. In his confession, Brian painted Denise as the driving force behind the plot. He claimed that she was the one who refused to consider divorce, the one who expressed concerns about the financial repercussions of separating. According to Brian, their relationship didn't just set the stage for the murder, it dictated it. Denise, he alleged, was the mastermind, the person who stood the most to gain from Mike's death. His testimony suggested that she had manipulated him into aiding in the crime, leveraging their affair to ensure his loyalty. But Brian's admission didn't settle everything. In exposing the details of the murder and implicating Denise, he also revealed the complexity of their relationship. Over time, the once convenient partnership between Denise and Brian began to crumble. The trust that had bound them during their plot unraveled, leaving room for paranoia and desperation to creep in. By the time Brian kidnapped Denise in 2016, their relationship had devolved into barely concealed hostility. His kidnapping attempt was, in part, an effort to keep Denise silent. He feared she might betray him, just as they had betrayed Mike. What he didn't realize was that his own actions would open the door to unravel everything. Brian's confession didn't just end years of speculation. It unmasked the full scope of a crime that had fooled investigators, friends, and family for nearly 2 decades. It revealed how 2 people had conspired to destroy a life and hide it behind a veil of normalcy. However, as the truth began to surface, so did questions about accountability. While Brian's role was now clear, Denise's part remained under scrutiny. If her involvement was as central as Brian claimed, why hadn't she faced consequences yet? And if she had orchestrated the plan, was justice finally closing in on her too? By this point, Denise's carefully constructed world had begun to collapse, but her legal fate was still to be determined. The courts now faced a critical decision: how to handle the woman whose life seemed built on lies, betrayal, and the ghost of the man she had once vowed to love. In May 2018, more than 17 years after Mike Williams vanished on what was initially thought to be a routine hunting trip, Denise Williams was arrested at Florida State University, where she worked. A grand jury had indicted her on multiple charges, including first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and accessory after the fact. The arrest came as a shock to many, but for investigators, it marked the culmination of years of mounting suspicion. Prosecutors accused Denise of masterminding the plot to kill her husband in order to be with Brian Winchester, her lover and longtime family friend. It wasn't just about their relationship, though. They pointed to the $1 million life insurance policy conveniently arranged by Brian himself as a key factor in Denise's alleged motivations. From the moment the charges became public, Denise's defense team emphatically denied her involvement. Her attorney, Ethan Way, was quick to assert that Denise had absolutely nothing to do with Mike Williams' disappearance and absolutely nothing to do with any of the crimes that Brian Winchester committed. He also criticized the timing of the indictment, noting that it followed Brian's incarceration for kidnapping Denise, an act that highlighted their fractured and volatile relationship. Nonetheless, prosecutors intended to make their case without hesitation, stating they would deny her bail and bring forward detailed evidence during trial. The case moved quickly. By late June 2018, Denise was ordered to remain in custody without bond, and a trial date was set for September of that year. Delays eventually pushed the trial to December, but when it finally began, both the prosecution and the defense faced the daunting task of disentangling nearly 2 decades of lies, cover-ups, and manipulation. For prosecutors, the heart of their case was Brian Winchester's testimony. As the state's star witness, Brian provided a damning first-hand account of the plot to kill Mike, painting Denise as the orchestrator. Brian took the stand and didn't hold back. He started by recounting his affair with Denise, which began in 1997, 3 years before Mike's disappearance. While both were still married to other people at the time, their relationship became more serious over time. According to Brian, the affair snowballed into something that couldn't be easily hidden or undone. He testified that the pair discussed various ways to be together, without dealing with the financial and social fallout of divorces. At one point, he said Denise had even suggested staging a boating accident on the Gulf of Mexico. Ultimately, though, they opted for a plan that involved a hunting trip, an activity Mike loved, and one that offered the perfect cover for an accident. In chilling detail, Brian described the events of December 16, 2000, the day he lured Mike to Lake Seminole with a promise of a routine duck hunting trip. Once on the water, Brian pushed Mike out of the boat, expecting him to drown quickly in the cold, murky lake while weighed down by his waders. But when Mike managed to stay afloat by clinging to a tree stump, Brian realized the plan wasn't going to work as smoothly as they'd intended. He took his shotgun and shot Mike in the face, ensuring his death. Afterward, Brian drove Mike's body to a predetermined location and buried him near Gardner Road in northern Leon County. The courtroom listened intently as Brian laid out not only the murder itself but also the conversations leading up to it. Conversations that, according to him, were driven by Denise. He portrayed her as the one who insisted they couldn't risk divorces and the one who pushed for Mike's death as the only solution. His testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, but it wasn't the only evidence they presented. Prosecutors introduced a recorded phone call between Kathy Thomas, Brian's ex-wife, and Denise. During the call, Kathy suggested she knew the truth about what had happened to Mike. Denise repeatedly tried to change the subject, but her apparent evasiveness raised more questions. At one point, she asked Kathy, "What do you know?" Prosecutors used this exchange to suggest that Denise was more than just an innocent party swept up in Brian's actions. Assistant State Attorney John Fuchs highlighted additional details to establish Denise's calculated role in the murder. He pointed out her calm, unemotional demeanor during key conversations about the crime, arguing that it reflected her cold-blooded involvement in planning her husband's death. The prosecution painted Denise as someone who had carefully balanced her image as a grieving widow while benefiting financially and personally from her husband's murder. The defense, led by Ethan Way, pushed back hard. Way argued there was no physical evidence directly tying Denise to the crime. He pointed out that the state had built its entire case around the testimony of a convicted felon, Brian Winchester, who had every incentive to shift blame onto someone else to save himself. Way expressed disbelief that Brian wasn't the one on trial, given that he had confessed to the murder. He framed Brian as an unreliable and self-serving witness whose plea deal had allowed him to avoid punishment for his actions. After 4 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for 8 hours, carefully weighing the conflicting narratives put forth by the prosecution and the defense. In the end, the jury returned a verdict. Denise Williams was guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. For Cheryl Williams, who had fought tirelessly for justice for her son, the verdict was vindication after nearly 2 decades of waiting and wondering. During sentencing in February 2019, Cheryl addressed the court and spoke of the pain Denise had caused. She said Denise had not only taken her son, but had also taken her granddaughter, Ansley, by cutting Cheryl out of their lives in the years following Mike's death. Denise, for her part, remained silent during sentencing. The court handed down a life sentence with no possibility of parole, ensuring that Denise would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The conviction brought some semblance of closure to the tragedy, but it didn't end the ripple effects of what had happened. 5 months after her sentencing, new developments added another layer to the aftermath. Denise signed over all assets tied to Mike's estate and insurance payouts to their daughter, Ansley. In doing so, she avoided prosecution for insurance fraud deal that came with strict conditions. Ansley was prohibited from using the funds to support Denise's legal appeals. Should she violate the agreement, she risked a 150-0 penalty. This legal maneuver effectively cut Denise off from the financial gains she had once sought, redirecting them to the daughter she had been accused of betraying. Today, Denise Williams remains incarcerated at the Florida Women's Reception Center. Her case is a stark reminder of the lengths some people will go to for money and personal gain, and the devastating consequences those actions can have on the lives of others. For Cheryl, though, it was simple. Justice had finally been served. Denise's conviction confirmed what she'd suspected for years. While the legal system had been slow to act, it had ultimately fulfilled its role in holding the guilty accountable. Still, the lingering question for many is how Mike's death could have been disguised as an accident for so long, and how easily it could have stayed that way had it not been for years of unrelenting pressure from Cheryl to uncover the truth. At first glance, the disappearance of Mike Williams seemed straightforward, a hunter caught in the wrong place at the wrong time in Lake Seminole's treacherous waters. But what began as a presumed accident unraveled into a story of deception, greed, and murder, proving just how misleading appearances can be. This case reveals not only how easily justice can be delayed, but also what it takes to see it through to the end. Mike's story is a testament to the power of persistence and the consequences of assumptions made too early in an investigation. The initial investigation into Mike's disappearance was, by all accounts, flawed. From the moment his boat and truck were found, law enforcement narrowed their focus to a single theory: an accidental drowning. They didn't treat the boat as a potential crime scene. Instead, it was promptly returned to his family. The area around the boat ramp, heavily trampled by volunteers and searchers, was never secured as a possible site of foul play. These decisions limited early efforts to collect evidence. One officer later admitted, "We didn't have a whole lot to go on except there was an empty boat and the guy didn't show up." This approach, assuming the simplest explanation, meant critical details were overlooked. The mistakes didn't stop there. The alligator theory became a convenient explanation for why Mike's body wasn't recovered. But experts eventually debunked it, pointing out that cold December temperatures made it highly unlikely that alligators were active, let alone feeding. This shaky theory allowed investigators to dismiss growing doubts about the circumstances of Mike's disappearance. Instead of digging deeper, they clung to a narrative that was increasingly inconsistent with the evidence's lack of it. By prematurely closing the case as an accident, they allowed the truth to stay buried far longer than it should have. Cheryl Williams emerged as the pivotal force in keeping her son's story alive. Where investigators had faltered, she refused to give up. Cheryl's determination to challenge the initial findings transformed a closed case into an active search for justice. Over the years, she wrote more than 200 letters to Florida's governor, imploring authorities to reopen the investigation. She purchased newspaper ads, put up billboards, and engaged the community, ensuring no one forgot that Mike was still missing. Cheryl's actions weren't just about finding answers, they were about questioning the assumptions others had been too quick to accept. This maternal persistence wasn't without its challenges. Cheryl faced skepticism and pushback from her community, and even within law enforcement. Many criticized her for not letting it go, viewing her relentless focus as an inability to grieve and move forward. She admitted, "I get criticized a lot for not admitting that Mike's dead. All I know is I can't stop looking for him until I find him." Her refusal to accept anything less than the truth eventually forced authorities to take a second look. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement reopened the case in 2004, 4 years after it had been officially closed. While the investigation still moved slowly, her efforts had planted the seeds for what was to come. The role of financial motives in Mike's disappearance also illustrates a critical lesson about investigative thoroughness. Not long after Mike was declared dead, Denise Williams collected a $1 million life insurance payout. While this would have raised immediate suspicions in other cases, it didn't lead to further scrutiny at the time. Investigators overlooked the details of the policy, which had been arranged by Brian Winchester, Denise's close confidant and later her husband. Together, Denise and Brian had the means, motive, and opportunity to benefit from Mike's death, something that only became clear years later when the case was officially revisited. The financial aspect highlights just how complicated missing persons investigations can become when relationships and money are involved. Authorities initially treated Denise and Brian's relationship as coincidental, not conspiratorial. They married 5 years after Mike's disappearance, blending their lives seamlessly despite whispers of wrongdoing. To outsiders, it might have appeared like two people leaning on each other in the wake of shared tragedy. But when paired with the financial gain she received and Brian's eventual admissions, their marriage became a glaring red flag that should have been noticed sooner. The delay in considering these connections allowed years of secrecy to pass, prolonging the search for truth. Another systemic issue the case exposed was the failure to think beyond the idea of a routine accident. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, which led the initial search, treated the case as a missing hunter incident from the start. While it's natural to assume the most straightforward explanation, doing so can lead investigators to overlook pivotal details. In Mike's case, this meant prematurely dismissing the possibility of foul play. Once the drowning theory took root, it framed every decision that followed. The search for evidence became an effort to confirm drowning, not to rule out alternative scenarios even when the recovered items, from his perfectly intact waders to his floating flashlight, painted a conflicting picture. The broader implications of Mike Williams' case extend to how investigators handle missing persons cases overall. It highlights the importance of considering not only environmental factors but also human behavior. Financial records, personal relationships, and potential motives should have been explored far earlier. These elements often hold the key to unearthing the truth, especially in cases that seem to defy logic. Had investigators conducted a more thorough examination of Mike's life, his marriage, his friendships, and his finances, the cracks in the story might have appeared sooner. What's especially unsettling about this case is how close it came to remaining unsolved. Without Cheryl's pressure and Brian's eventual confession, Mike Williams likely would have been forever remembered as a victim of a tragic accident. His remains might never have been found, and the scheme to murder him might have succeeded without consequence. This reality underscores the need for persistence, both from law enforcement and from families, in pursuing justice. Cheryl's tireless advocacy serves as a reminder that one voice, even when ignored or dismissed, can make a difference in uncovering the truth. The Mike Williams case also acts as a warning about the power of unchecked assumptions. It's easy to believe the simplest narrative, especially in cases where evidence isn't immediately clear. But as this story demonstrates, the most obvious answer isn't always the correct one. For investigators, this means keeping an open mind, treating even seemingly routine disappearances with the care and thoroughness of a potential criminal case. For the public, it means resisting the urge to accept surface-level explanations that might let the true perpetrators slip away unnoticed. Ultimately, Mike's story reminds us that justice can be a long, difficult process. It stretches beyond the confines of an investigation and into the lives of those left behind. For Cheryl, that meant years of heartbreak and frustration, chasing a truth everyone else seemed willing to give up on. For investigators, it meant revisiting their early missteps and asking hard questions about what they'd missed. And for Denise and Brian, it meant the eventual unraveling of a web of lies they had spent years weaving. But the broader lesson is one of vigilance. Questioning inconsistencies, examining motives, and applying consistent pressure are all essential in the pursuit of justice. Whether it's the role of financial incentives, overlooked evidence, or the human desire to explain away tragedy, Mike's case shows that justice isn't always immediate, but it's always worth pursuing. In the end, the persistence of one determined mother proved stronger than the lies of two people who thought they had fooled everyone. As we reflect on this case, one lesson stands out: trust your instincts. Cheryl Williams refused to let go of the feeling that something was wrong, and her persistence changed everything. The truth may not have come easily, but it came. And sometimes, that's exactly what justice looks like. The story of Mike Williams is one of deception, betrayal, and a mother's unwavering fight for justice. Cheryl Williams' refusal to accept the explanations handed to her proved that persistence can uncover the truth, even when it feels impossible. Her advocacy forced authorities to re-examine a case that could have easily been forgotten. "I can't stop looking for him until I find him," she once said, a sentiment that defined her journey. This case is a reminder to question everything: the surface-level answers, the motives, and the trust we place in others. Justice isn't instant, but it's always worth pursuing. In 2012, a teenage girl walked out of her family home and was never seen alive again. What followed were shocking revelations about a seemingly safe community harboring a dark secret. But what made this case truly unforgettable was what investigators discovered years later, something they never thought they'd find. Please leave a like and comment down below what time it is wherever you are. This ensures more true crime stories in the future. Let's get to it. Nestled in the heart of northern Idaho, the town of Rathdrum was surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. It wasn't a place where people worried about locking their doors at night. With fewer than 0 residents at the time, it was the kind of tight-knit community where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Parents felt safe letting their children ride bikes through the neighborhood, and neighbors offered friendly waves or unhurried conversations as they mowed their lawns or walked their dogs. Violent crime was something locals read about in the news, happening in distant cities, not something that touched Rathdrum itself. It was this sense of relative peace and safety that would make what happened here all the more shocking. The morning of September 5th, 2016, started like any other in the quiet town. Families were returning home from Labor Day weekend trips, preparing for the start of the school year. The community was still humming with a sense of routine as people bustled about without much thought or worry. Among them was 17-year-old Madison Graham, a high school senior known for her outgoing personality and dreams of becoming a veterinarian. She loved animals, especially her rescue cat, Tigger, and was always willing to help out neighbors with pet sitting or dog walking. Friends described her as someone who could light up a room with her laughter and kindness. That morning, as Madison walked out the door around 9:00 a.m., no one in her family thought anything was out of the ordinary. She mentioned heading to a friend's house and promised to be back by lunchtime. But Madison didn't come back. At first, her family wasn't too concerned. Madison was responsible and not the type to run off without a word. When she didn't answer her phone, they figured maybe her battery had died or she lost track of time while chatting with her friend. Several hours passed, and by early evening, worry had started to creep in. Calls to her close friends yielded the same response. No one had seen or heard from her all day. It wasn't like her to not check in. The last confirmed sighting of Madison was by a neighbor who saw her walking down the quiet residential street, backpack slung over one shoulder and earbuds in, humming along as she disappeared around the corner. By the time the sun set, panic had replaced the initial reassurance that she'd turn up. Madison's parents, Karen and Joe, called the police to report her missing. The initial response, as in many missing person cases, was cautious. Teenagers often stayed out later than expected, and most turned up within hours. Officers advised the family to wait overnight, hoping Madison would walk through the door. Maybe she ran into a friend, they suggested, trying to calm the panic in Karen's voice. But Karen felt deep in her gut that something was wrong. "This isn't like Madison," she insisted. She would have called. Those first 24 hours after someone goes missing are often the most critical, according to experts. It's in this window that investigators gather crucial details to track the person's movements. A 2019 study published by the National Institute of Justice found that immediate action, especially in small towns where resources may be limited, can make all the difference. Rathdrum's local officers, however, were working with limited manpower, and no sign of foul play in Madison's case. Without clear evidence of a struggle or injury, the initial search efforts were subdued. Officers drove through the streets looking for any sign of her, while family and friends called her cell phone repeatedly, only to go straight to voicemail. Karen and Joe began contacting everyone Madison had spoken to in the days prior. Her best friend Jessie admitted to seeing her 2 days earlier, but said they hadn't made concrete plans to hang out. Her boyfriend, Marcus, said he hadn't heard from her at all that morning. By sunrise on September 6th, the situation grew more serious. Volunteers joined Madison's parents in scouring parks, trails, and parking lots around Rathdrum. They handed out flyers featuring Madison's warm smile and the clothes she was last known to wear, a grey hoodie and ripped jeans. The search extended into the nearby forests that surrounded the town, with volunteers calling her name into the trees, hoping desperately for a response. Still, there was no sign of Madison. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The lack of clues baffled everyone involved. Her phone, which would usually be a vital piece of evidence in cases like this, had not been located or turned back on. There was no digital trail of calls, messages, or social media activity that could provide a lead. Search dogs brought in on the second day circled the area near her home, but the scent trail disappeared less than a quarter-mile down the street. It was as though Madison had been plucked off the face of the earth. With every hour that passed, the chances of finding her diminished, and the Graham family's dread intensified. By the third day, Rathdrum residents were no longer going about their routines with the same carefree ease. Parents were driving their children to school instead of letting them walk, despite the short distances. Conversation at the local diner shifted from small talk to whispered theories about what might have happened to Madison. Was she still nearby? Had someone taken her? Nobody wanted to say the worst out loud, but the underlying fear was palpable. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was a crack in the foundation of their safe little town. All of this was overshadowed by the glaring question that no one could answer. How could a 17-year-old girl, walking down her own street in broad daylight, disappear without a trace? Each theory raised more concerns. If it had been an accident, there would have been some evidence, tire marks, a discarded shoe, or even a call from a witness. Yet there was nothing. If it had been abduction, why had no one seen anything unusual? Rathdrum wasn't the kind of town where strangers blended in unnoticed. The police admitted that they were stumped. Days stretched into a week with no sign of Madison or the slightest explanation for her disappearance. Her family began holding vigils at the small park where she often walked their dog. Candles and flowers piled up around her photograph, casting a somber reminder to the town that the search was far from over. Karen, unable to hold back tears, spoke to the small crowd at one of the vigils. "Someone out there knows something," she said softly. "Please, if you've seen anything, if you've heard anything, don't stay silent." Though the image of Madison's bright smile on the missing posters brought a glimmer of hope, the mood in Rathdrum was grim. The police maintained their search, but the absence of any meaningful breakthroughs began to weigh on everyone involved. It was beginning to look like Madison's case might become one of the many haunting mysteries to go unsolved, until a simple observation, just days later, uprooted everything investigators thought they knew. For the first week after Madison Graham's disappearance, the investigation seemed to be spinning in circles. Every potential lead turned up empty, and the small-town police force struggled to uncover anything concrete. Flyers had blanketed the area, but none of the calls coming into the local tip line produced anything actionable. Neighbors reported seeing Madison heading toward her friend's house but couldn't recall seeing her after that. Detectives pulled hours' worth of surveillance footage from businesses along the street, but none captured so much as a fleeting glimpse of her. The public began to grow restless. In such a close-knit community, the idea that someone simply disappeared without a trace felt unimaginable. Frustration boiled over during a town hall meeting organized by Madison's family. Many attendees expressed anger at what they perceived as a slow response from law enforcement. Others voiced fears that whoever was responsible might still be among them. Karen Graham spoke during the meeting, her voice trembling. "We don't care how small the detail is," she pleaded. "If you know something, please, say something." That plea would unexpectedly make the difference. 3 days later, on September 11th, an employee at a gas station on the edge of town found something while taking out the trash. It was a cell phone, slightly scratched, with its screen shattered. At first, the discovery didn't seem remarkable. Found phones after busy weekends were fairly common, and the employee assumed someone had simply dropped it at the pump, but something told her to hold on to it and turn it over to her manager. What happened next might never have come to light if the store owner hadn't seen one of Madison's missing posters while running errands shortly afterward. The photo of Madison bore a striking resemblance to the face on the phone's lock screen. The manager called the police immediately. When investigators arrived, the phone was confirmed to be Madison's. It was the first tangible piece of evidence connected to her since she'd disappeared. But what it revealed raised more questions than answers. The phone's location wasn't along her known route to her friend's house. It was miles away, near the industrial outskirts of town. A recovery team carefully combed the area, hoping this meant they would find additional clues, but nothing else was discovered in the immediate vicinity. The lack of physical evidence surrounding the phone's recovery baffled police. Had someone deliberately placed it there? And if so, why? What police did have, however, was the chance to search the phone's data history. Although the lock screen obstructed full access, the idea was brought up to conduct a forensic examination of the device. Over the next 48 hours, specialized IT technicians began combing through the fragments of data that could be recovered. According to law enforcement, one small breakthrough that put this lead over the edge had to do with emergency contacts logged into the device. Forensic technicians found a clue in the form of an unsent text message. It was short, just a few words, but it sent chills down investigators' spines. It simply read, "Please, come G," which trailed off as though interrupted before it could be finished. This message had never been sent but remained stored deep within the unsaved metadata of the phone. The implications of that unfinished text message reframed the timeline of Madison's disappearance entirely. Police now believed she may have tried to reach out for help only moments before something happened to her. Equally concerning was the fact that testing revealed the phone had stopped connecting to local cell towers roughly an hour after Madison was last seen, meaning it had likely been shut off manually. Even though this was a far cry from definitively knowing what happened, it was finally enough to convince detectives they weren't dealing with a runaway or a tragic accident. Someone had Madison's phone, and possibly Madison herself. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the first actionable clue in missing persons cases often comes from persistence in expanding the search radius. Investigators in this case dug back through the areas surrounding where the phone had been found, determined to leave no stone unturned. Even slight irregularities could hold vital answers. This wider effort yielded a sighting that had previously gone unnoticed. A witness from a nearby auto parts store remembered seeing a vehicle that seemed out of place parked near the gas station on September 5, the day Madison vanished. It was described as an older model grey pickup truck with dents along one side. The driver, the witness claimed, appeared to be a man in his late 30s or early 40s who seemed to be in a hurry. Although details were limited, the sighting ruled out previous speculation that Madison had been abducted by someone she knew or had willingly walked into a situation with a trusted person. This vehicle belonged to someone who didn't fit into any known patterns in Madison's life. As strange as it seemed at the time, the mention of that truck jolted an older piece of vague information back to life. Within the first 48 hours of the investigation, a local resident had called in to report having heard screeching tires coming from the gas station's general direction around the time Madison was thought to have disappeared. This detail had initially been dismissed due to the lack of supporting evidence, but now, with confirmation of a vehicle in the area, it became relevant once again. Investigators returned to that resident, who described the sound as quick and abrupt, followed by what they thought sounded like metal hitting metal. Though lacking precision, this recollection helped shape the emerging narrative of what could have taken place in the hours after her disappearance. The small stack of findings, Madison's phone, the witness account of the truck, and the memory of screeching tires, gave investigators just enough to ask the public for help in identifying a truck matching the description. They released a bulletin to local television stations and circulated it widely online, requesting anyone with information about who owned or drove such a vehicle to contact Rathdrum police. Within hours, the tip line was buzzing. Although several of the calls were false leads, one stood out. A caller mentioned seeing a similar vehicle parked outside the property of a man who had recently moved to the area, but no one in the neighborhood seemed to know him well. He had introduced himself as Aaron, didn't wave to neighbors, and kept to himself for the most part, except for brief grocery runs. What caught the caller's attention was that Aaron had spent several hours quickly hosing down the truck and scrubbing its interior on the afternoon of September 6th, the day Madison's phone was discovered several miles away. Armed with this information, police tracked down the truck in question and identified the individual connected to it. His actual name was Gerald Anderson, a lifelong drifter with a history of short-term work and minor criminal offences across state lines. Anderson claimed he was new to Rathdrum, choosing the area for its quiet atmosphere and opportunities for work in the local lumber yards. His answers seemed plausible on the surface, but something about his demeanour unsettled investigators. According to police, Anderson was cooperative but overly nervous during early conversations, an observation that would later stand out as investigators began piecing more of his background together. For the first time since Madison's disappearance shook the town, detectives had someone they could officially call a person of interest. The discovery of Madison's phone may have been the initial turning point, but it was the relentless legwork, pulling at small threads, carefully rechecking details most would overlook, that opened the door to focusing on Gerald Anderson. What came next would peel back the layers of his life and shine a light on secrets lurking beneath Rathdrum's peaceful exterior. Gerald Anderson's name was barely known in Rathdrum before Madison Graham's disappearance. He had arrived in town only months earlier, renting a small, run-down house on the outskirts of the community. Neighbors described him as quiet and a bit standoffish, but not unusual enough to draw attention. The older model grey truck parked in his driveway became a common sight, though it often seemed to be coming and going at odd hours. When police knocked on his door after receiving the tip about him cleaning the truck shortly after Madison's disappearance, Anderson appeared calm, even polite. He answered officers' questions without hesitation, saying he had driven to a nearby lake to fish on the morning Madison vanished. What Anderson failed to explain, or perhaps assumed the police wouldn't notice, was why his version of events didn't match up with the witness's description of his truck near the gas station. Investigators had already placed his vehicle in the area during the critical time frame. Though Anderson insisted he had no connection to Madison whatsoever, the investigators couldn't ignore the irregularities in his story. And they didn't have to dig very deep to find more of them. One of the most glaring issues was Anderson's alibi. He claimed he had spent several hours fishing alone, but he couldn't name anyone who might have seen him there. When officers pressed him on specifics, such as what time he left or where exactly he had been along the lake, his responses grew increasingly vague. A few times, he stumbled over his words, contradicting earlier details. Police noted his demeanour had shifted. While he maintained a cooperative attitude on the surface, his body language told another story. Tapping fingers, avoiding prolonged eye contact, and shifting uncomfortably. In a town like Rathdrum, where people rarely needed airtight alibis, Anderson's unconvincing explanation stood out. It wasn't just his behaviour during questioning that raised red flags. As investigators ran background checks, Anderson's past began to emerge. Though there was nothing on file linking him to violent crimes, there were reports of other behavioural warning signs. In one incident, years earlier, Anderson had been accused of stealing from a co-worker at a lumberyard in Oregon. The charges had been dropped, but the employer described him as strange and secretive, recalling how Anderson would disappear during shifts and avoid conversations unless absolutely necessary. Neighbours in previous towns where Anderson had lived painted a picture of someone who deliberately kept others at arm's length. None of this was proof of involvement in Madison's disappearance, but it showed a pattern. Anderson didn't live the kind of life that left behind deep ties or trustworthy witnesses. Searching for answers, detectives began comparing Anderson's responses to the timeline of the day Madison vanished. They identified a 2-hour window during which her phone had last pinged a tower near the industrial area and eventually went offline. This placed the phone in an area that Anderson frequently passed while heading to and from his rental property. While subtle, this coincidence was enough for police to request a warrant to search his truck. What they found inside deepened their suspicions. At first glance, the vehicle appeared clean, too clean actually. The interior was spotless, with seats wiped down to an almost obsessive degree. Detectives noticed the faint scent of bleach in the air, which Anderson shrugged off as just cleaning supplies. But forensic analysts found traces of dirt and vegetation under the floor mats, and tiny fragments of fabric wedged into the crevices of the truck's cabin. These items didn't tell a story on their own, but their presence contradicted Anderson's claim that he rarely drove outside of town, except for errands or fishing trips. It suggested he had spent time in wooded or rural areas, not accounted for in his account of the day Madison went missing. One of the reasons investigators grew so focused on Anderson was his seemingly average life. On the surface, his lifestyle appeared completely normal. To the casual observer, Anderson came across as just another working-class man trying to make ends meet. He paid his rent on time, nodded politely to cashiers at the grocery store, and occasionally struck up small talk with neighbors about the weather. But it was the details that began to unravel that facade. Experts often point to a psychological pattern in cases like this. Suspects attempting to conceal involvement in a crime often go out of their way to appear ordinary. They know the weight of suspicion and overcompensate to avoid drawing attention. Anderson wasn't just polite, his behavior was almost too careful, as if choreographed to deflect scrutiny. One of Anderson's neighbors, who spoke anonymously to police, shared something unsettling. A few days after Madison disappeared, they'd noticed Anderson returning home late at night, carrying what looked like a large plastic bag. The bag appeared heavy, and Anderson had quickly walked it around to the back of the property, seemingly aware that someone might be watching. The neighbor dismissed it at first, assuming he was likely disposing of regular household trash. But when news of the investigation surfaced, they began to doubt their initial impressions. The sight of Anderson hosing down his truck for hours after that night only deepened their concerns. Meanwhile, investigators broadened their focus to Anderson's online activity. A search of his internet history revealed that, in the days before Madison's disappearance, he had conducted numerous searches for topics connected to wooded trails, surveillance camera, blind spots, and even articles about missing persons cases. Perhaps most unsettling of all, he had looked up methods on how to wipe down surfaces to eliminate trace evidence. While not necessarily incriminating on their own, these searches painted the image of someone who had been preparing for something not a typical activity for someone with a straightforward, quiet routine. Despite mounting circumstantial evidence, detectives lacked the definitive proof they needed to connect Anderson directly to Madison's disappearance. That changed when another neighbor stepped forward with a new tip. Several months earlier, they recalled hearing Anderson talking to a contractor who had visited the property about how he knew every trail in the woods like the back of his hand. The neighbor also noticed something peculiar. Anderson would leave the house carrying shovels and work gloves, heading towards secluded areas nearby. When asked if Anderson explained this behavior, the neighbor could only remember him laughing it off as yard work his landlord would never notice. To investigators, these habits suddenly seemed far more intentional. Anderson's behavior in and around wooded areas near Rathdrum prompted a painstaking search of his known haunts. A task force was brought in to scour several hiking and logging trails. Anderson had mentioned casually in conversations. The effort took days, but it paid off with an unsettling discovery. Less than a mile into one of the hiking trails, searchers found a small cluster of disturbed soiler patch that seemed different from the surrounding forest floor. Forensic teams rushed in, and beneath that disturbed earth, they uncovered a series of items that included fragments of torn clothing. One piece matched what Madison had been wearing on the day she was last seen, a section of denim that matched her ripped jeans, along with traces of grey fabric nearby. While these items didn't constitute direct evidence tying Anderson to the crime, their presence added to the growing pile of inconsistencies surrounding his story. Police pressed him harder during subsequent interviews, questioning him specifically about his time spent in wooded areas and his unexplained trips at odd hours. Under the weight of mounting evidence, Anderson began to crack. His previously rehearsed calm started to slip, and his responses became shorter, evasive. He now denied ever having been to the area where the clothing was found, despite his earlier statements about knowing the trails. It was clear to detectives that he was growing overwhelmed. According to psychological experts, This type of pressure often brings out telling behaviors in suspects who believe their normal facade is collapsing. Anderson wasn't just faltering, he was unraveling in real time. With the discovery of the clothing fragments and Anderson's deteriorating composure, police upgraded him from a person of interest to their primary suspect. This shift came with renewed urgency. They obtained additional warrants to search his property and his truck more thoroughly. During this search, forensic experts would uncover a final piece of evidence, a fragment of material embedded in the truck's seat that appeared to match the torn fabric from the hiking trail. Now, the case against Gerald Anderson was stronger than ever. But it wasn't just the evidence that sealed his fate. It was a combination of his inconsistent alibis, nervous demeanor, and his attempts to hide behind the veneer of an ordinary life. For investigators, it became clear that uncovering the truth about Madison's disappearance would hinge on everything tying back to Anderson's seemingly mundane world. That revelation was just the beginning of the case against him. What came next would make it undeniable. With Gerald Anderson now identified as the prime suspect in Madison Graham's disappearance, investigators turned their attention to piecing together stronger evidence that could definitively link him to the crime. For weeks, teams of officers and forensic analysts reviewed everything they had: witness statements, search records, and physical evidence. It was a grueling process, made even more difficult by the limited resources available in their small town. Still, it hadn't added up to enough, and the clock was ticking. Detectives worried that if they couldn't build a solid case soon, the trail might go cold. This was when they made the decision to re-evaluate an area they had already combed during early search efforts, a densely wooded section of Rathdrum's outskirts. Known for its narrow trails and quiet spots frequented by hikers and hunters, it was already notorious for being difficult to search thoroughly. The decision to go back wasn't instinctive but rather almost accidental. During a strategy meeting, one of the investigators suggested that Anderson's comments about knowing the trails pointed to the possibility he might have relied on a more remote, less travelled payphone that could have gone unnoticed in prior sweeps. It wasn't a new lead as much as it was about looking at old paths with a sharper sense of focus. Earlier grid searches in this area had focused on parts of the trail closest to the main road, but this time, officers expanded their radius deeper into the terrain. The search, aided by an advanced drone equipped with imaging sensors, allowed detectives to map the landscape more thoroughly. It didn't take long for something to stand out. A patch of soil along an embankment appeared almost too neat, as if it had been carefully smoothed over, unlike the rest of the area, where leaves and debris covered the ground. At first glance, it wasn't anything dramatic, just an uneven section of dirt smaller than a picnic table, but for the officers combing through the woods, it was enough to trigger their instincts. Forensic specialists were called in to investigate further. As they scraped away at the soil, they began uncovering what appeared to be pieces of fabric. The initial task was slow and methodical, with every layer of dirt being examined carefully to preserve potential evidence. Within hours, the fragments of denim recovered were confirmed as part of the ripped jeans Madison had been wearing the day she disappeared. The discovery, while heartbreaking, was the first piece of physical evidence that directly tied her to the remote location. Officers shifted their efforts into overdrive, scanning every inch of the site for additional clues. The question that arose almost immediately was how this site had been missed in the earlier searches. The truth was, it's not uncommon for evidence to go unnoticed in initial investigations. According to a report on law enforcement strategies by the National Criminal Justice Reference Service, over 20% of significant evidence in missing persons cases is found in areas already searched, mostly due to human error, resource challenges, or the sheer complexity of the terrain. Small police departments like Rathdrum's often struggle with limited manpower and tools in the first weeks of a case, causing them to focus on what seems like the most accessible or obvious places. But why was this patch significant? Because it wasn't just an isolated location. It was only a short walk from one of the lesser-known trails Anderson had reportedly mentioned to another neighbor. This detail, combined with the distinct impression that the soil had been disturbed intentionally, convinced detectives that this might have been something far more calculated than they originally thought. The physical evidence began connecting Anderson to the scene, and suddenly, his claims of innocence seemed implausibly thin. The team didn't stop there. While investigators worked on the trail site, digital forensics experts revisited Madison's phone records, motivated by the discovery of her phone several days after she went missing. The analysis, which focused on the metadata buried within her smartphone, painted a chilling picture. It revealed a pattern of movement that matched closely with the areas Anderson regularly drove through and, most notably, showed her phone had been manually turned off in the vicinity of the industrial area. This put to rest any lingering theories about an accidental disappearance or involvement by an unknown party. It strengthened the narrative that whoever abducted Madison had a deliberate plan, one that was centered in places Anderson knew well. Evidence continued piling up when the forensic team analyzed the vehicle Anderson had painstakingly cleaned. Despite his best efforts, traces of soil under the wheel wells were consistent with the type of dirt found at the wooded site where Madison's jeans had been located. Additionally, tiny follicles of hair were recovered from the fabric of the truck's seats. DNA testing would later confirm that these samples matched Madison's. Taken alone, any one of these pieces might have been too small to definitively implicate someone, but together they told a compelling story. There's a term often used by law enforcement experts: confirmation bias. It describes the tendency to focus on information that supports one theory, while unintentionally ignoring details that contradict it. This phenomenon can lead to key evidence being missed or dismissed entirely. Early in Madison's case, the search effort had fallen victim to this, largely because investigators had focused their attention on likely scenarios based on statistics from potential abductions by strangers to accidental injuries near the woods. But Anderson's careful planning, coupled with the remoteness of the wooded area, made it a perfect storm of misdirection. As one lead detective noted, "We didn't realize until later how much of this case was hiding in plain sight." One of the most surprising discoveries, however, came not from physical evidence but from revisiting another piece of Anderson's behavior. Detectives had initially overlooked just how detailed his knowledge of the trails was when they'd first questioned him. While this seemed like nothing more than an odd comment at the time, in hindsight, it revealed how calculated he might have been. Someone unfamiliar with the area would have struggled to navigate the dense terrain, but Anderson's repeated mentions of perfect places to clear his mind now felt eerily specific. Revisiting his interviews with this new lens allows even the smallest detail to carry weight: the pauses in his speech, the casual deflections when asked about long gaps in his alibi. Yet, the discovery that proved most damning came from a place no one had initially thought to check: inside a second-hand store a few miles from Rathdrum. During routine calls to local businesses, police followed up with a clerk who had mentioned a man selling items shortly after Madison's disappearance. One of the items handed in that day was a small silver bracelet. While such a piece of jewelry might not stand out otherwise, it was distinctive enough to catch Karen Graham's eye when investigators showed it to her. It was a gift Madison had received for her 16th birthday, engraved with her initials and a small daisy charm. The clerk described the seller as middling in height, with dark hair, wearing a baseball cap that hid most of his face. While they couldn't positively identify Anderson from memory alone, the time frame matched his frequent trips into town. This bracelet shifted the stakes entirely. It wasn't just circumstantial anymore. It was personal, intimate, like a thread connecting Anderson directly to Madison's disappearance. Despite his attempts at cleaning his truck, erasing his tracks, and keeping his movements vague, he had slipped in this one moment. This one item revealed the fragile cracks in his careful planning. The combined weight of the disturbed soil, the fabric fragments, the digital evidence, and now the bracelet led police to confront Anderson once more. He claimed the bracelet meant nothing, suggesting it might have been planted to frame him. His voice was uneven as he stumbled over his defense. Investigators weren't buying it. With every question, the holes in his story widened, and his once bland facade gave way to visible panic. While the evidence collected pointed in Anderson's direction, authorities knew they still faced an uphill battle proving premeditation. There was enough to arrest him, but building a case strong enough for conviction would involve untangling the timeline further and painting a fuller picture of what had happened to Madison. Though the woods had revealed critical clues, the legal case was only beginning to take shape. The bracelet, the fragments of her clothing, and the corresponding DNA evidence linked Anderson incontrovertibly, but prosecutors needed to ensure no detail could be twisted in his defense. Anderson's clean image was quickly disintegrating as the investigation progressed. Slowly, his actions weren't just viewed through the lens of suspicion, they began to look calculated and deliberate. The challenge now would be convincing a courtroom of his intent. Detectives prepared for the next phase with a critical eye, knowing they would need to tighten every loose thread before the trial began. The investigation into Madison Graham's disappearance was hitting its stride, but as the evidence against Gerald Anderson stacked up, police began to see cracks in what had seemed like the whole picture. A deeper dive into his background revealed inconsistencies that stretched far beyond Rathdrum. Detectives found themselves asking a question they hadn't considered before. Could Madison's case be part of a pattern? Anderson wasn't a lifelong resident of Idaho. In fact, he'd moved to Rathdrum less than a year before Madison went missing. A transient work history combined with frequent changes in address suggested that Anderson had never put down roots anywhere. This discovery prompted investigators to expand their search to look outside their cozy, wooded town and into jurisdictions Anderson might have passed through before arriving in Rathdrum. The shift in focus brought an immediate challenge. Each state, and even individual counties within a state, operates with its own systems, protocols, and access to resources. Detectives from Rathdrum were now stepping into unfamiliar territory, navigating everything from varying police procedures to the need for approval from different state law enforcement offices. Coordinating across states is never easy, one investigator later admitted in an interview. What's a priority in one jurisdiction might be gathering dust in another, but when you're chasing someone like Anderson, you don't have a choice, you just start piecing it together wherever you can. The first significant sign that this case could span beyond Idaho surfaced during a follow-up on Anderson's work history. Investigators learned that he had spent several months living in southeastern Washington, working odd jobs in construction and logging. Rathdrum police shared this information with Washington's state authorities, which brought a surprising response. It turned out that Anderson's name had come up in a local investigation around the same time he'd lived there. Specifically, police in the area had received a report about a young woman who had gone missing after leaving a grocery store late one evening. While the case was ultimately marked as unresolved, neighbors in the area had remembered seeing a grey truck parked near the entrance to a hiking trail less than a mile from the store. The description of the vehicle was eerily similar to Anderson's. The parallels between Madison's case and this one were difficult to ignore. Both involved small towns, wooded areas, and women who vanished without obvious explanation. The woman in Washington, however, had never been found, leaving fewer clues for investigators to work with. While detectives didn't have enough to prove a definitive connection between the two cases, they did find something else. Thanks to advancements in nationwide police databases, they were able to track the VIN number for Anderson's truck. What they uncovered was another breadcrumb. Toll records from Oregon showed that the vehicle had been logged passing through a series of highway checkpoints not long after the woman disappeared. This was where the investigation became increasingly complex. With evidence now suggesting Anderson had traveled extensively throughout the Pacific Northwest, detectives realized they needed to build a timeline of his movements. But piecing together cross-state activity isn't straightforward. Information sharing between jurisdictions can sometimes be slow, especially when agencies are dealing with high caseloads. Yet, modern technology came to their aid. Law enforcement's use of systems like VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, and digital surveillance software gave them a way to compare open cases across county and state lines. By entering Anderson's name, vehicle information, and description of his methods, detectives pulled reports of similar disappearances. The results, and the sheer number of them, were staggering. One of those reports led them to Montana, 3 years before Madison's disappearance. In another small rural town, a 22-year-old woman had been reported missing after setting out on an evening jog and never returning. Though her case had faded from public attention, her parents had held on to hope that she might one day be found. Details about her disappearance echoed patterns investigators were seeing in Anderson. She had been last spotted on a trail at dusk, and witnesses later recalled a partially obscured truck parked nearby. This truck, described as grey with noticeable dents, had so far eluded efforts to track it down and had been labelled as a dead lead. Now, with Anderson on their radar, authorities in Montana reopened the case, eager to see if they could match him to the scene. Working across multiple states came with its own difficulties, however. Investigators encountered jurisdictional walls where evidence couldn't always be shared immediately, and state laws meant that even something as simple as issuing a subpoena required careful coordination. Rathdrum's small team leaned heavily on the support of FBI field offices, which streamlined communications between different agencies involved. It wasn't an easy process, but slowly, connections began to take form. One of the more striking links came through forensic analysis tied to Anderson's truck. Soil samples taken from the undercarriage of the vehicle were sent to labs for detailed comparison. Analysts found traces of sediment that were consistent with areas in Montana and Oregon, in addition to the dirt from Rathdrum's wooded trails. Scientists were able to determine that the geological match was near perfect in areas close to known disappearance sites. For soil specialists working on the case, this not only confirmed Anderson's travel through these areas, but suggested he had potentially driven through or stopped near the exact locations where women had been reported missing. Another breakthrough came through phone records. Though Anderson had routinely switched devices, investigators recovered correspondence from an old prepaid phone he had once used. The records showed sporadic activity in states like Utah and Nevada, as if Anderson had made brief visits before returning to his usual routes. One transaction tied to the phone even showed him checking into a small motel along the border of Nevada and California, a place just 20 miles from where an unidentified woman's remains had been found off a rural highway in 2015. While this particular case didn't share all the hallmarks of Anderson's suspected involvement, the proximity made it difficult for authorities to completely rule him out. Of course, what made this situation especially hard to take for families was the sense of time slipping away. Many of the cases Anderson was now being linked to stretched back years, and without definitive evidence or admissions, those investigations were left suspended in uncertainty. But Rathdrum police remained focused. Modern tools, re-examined evidence, and sheer determination were slowly building a trail that brought Anderson closer to remaining accountable, not just for Madison but for the others. Technology shaped the way movement patterns were reconstructed. License plate cameras, sometimes forgotten in older cases, were revisited with fresh interest. Detectives pulled archived footage from highways and public intersections that Anderson was thought to have driven through at various points in his cross-state travels. In one recorded image, dated to late 2016 and captured at the edge of a Wyoming rest stop, Anderson's unmistakable grey truck appears paused at the side of the road. While no significant event was tied directly to that sighting, it confirmed a troubling truth. Anderson hadn't stayed in one town or state for long. He was elusive and mobile, choosing remote spots to blend into. The turning point came when all these pieces, digital breadcrumbs, physical evidence, and individual reports, began aligning. A review of Anderson's documented phone history placed him in the same vicinity as 2 Montana disappearance cases within days of when each victim was last seen. Cellular activity proved essential in narrowing gaps left by earlier investigations. Texts made using burner phones revealed subtle planning, Anderson sending messages late at night that hinted at scouting locations near isolated highways. One detective described the discovery of this data as the missing hinge, which tied the wide-ranging movement patterns together into one coherent narrative. The final confirmation wasn't flashy, but it was enough to leave an impact. Police working across state lines identified gas station receipts from southern Oregon that showed Anderson stopping for supplies. These receipts were time-stamped just hours after a woman in the area had failed to return home from an errand. The store's surveillance system caught the grey truck pulling into the lot, and while Anderson wasn't clearly visible, his distinctive walking gait matched earlier footage from Rathdrum's parking lot recordings. For officers who had spent months chasing faint trails, this moment felt decisive. Each state's data might have been barely noticeable on its own, but when combined, it told a story of careful evasion and deliberate planning. Now, detectives had more than just suspicions. The physical evidence, like the soil samples and the laundry list of vehicle sightings, placed him in key locations. His purchase of burner phones and casual movements across state lines showed an unsettling level of forethought. These weren't isolated incidents, but rather the signs of someone who had taken advantage of small towns and quiet landscapes to operate in the shadows. What had started as a local investigation in Rathdrum was now part of something much larger. But even with multiple threads tying him to Madison and other cases, one critical piece of the puzzle remained. What had Anderson confessed, or concealed, about that morning in Rathdrum? Detectives weren't ready to let their focus waver. His next interrogation would test their patience and strategies, but most importantly, it would determine if Anderson would finally admit the truth. After months of effort, and the growing weight of evidence tying Gerald Anderson to multiple disappearance cases, investigators sat him down for what they hoped would be the defining moment in the case. At this stage, they had soil samples, fragments of Madison Graham's clothing, and digital traces placing her and Anderson's vehicle in the same locations. They also had the bracelet recovered from the second-hand store that Madison's mother, Karen, had heartbreakingly confirmed as her daughter's. Anderson's incongruent alibis hadn't helped his credibility, and the evidence spoke louder than he ever could. But detectives knew a confession would be the key to locking in their case. Without it, Anderson could argue circumstantial evidence and complicate their chances at trial. The interrogation began early in the morning, with Anderson seated alone in a small, austere room. A half-empty cup of coffee sat in front of him, untouched, as the detective interviewing him quietly shuffled his notes. Anderson sat back in his chair, arms crossed, his face calm but closed off, watching every movement in the room. For minutes, there was silence. Standard procedure in many interrogations, designed to make the person being questioned feel the weight of that stillness. Finally, the detective began by laying the groundwork. He talked Anderson through the process, explaining how investigations evolve and why the evidence they'd collected couldn't just be dismissed. "I told them everything already," Anderson interrupted early on, his voice smooth but clipped. He reiterated the same points from his previous statements. He'd gone to the lake to fish, he didn't know Madison Graham, and he had nothing to do with her disappearance. The detective didn't interrupt him. Part of what makes police interrogations an effective tool, according to criminal psychologists, is patience. It's about creating just the right amount of tension so the suspect feels compelled to speak further in order to fill the gaps. As the hours passed, Anderson's calm demeanor started showing signs of strain. The detective presented timeline evidence, suggesting discrepancies in his story about where he'd been that morning and when. He posed questions Anderson couldn't fully answer, like why soil matching the wooded site near Rathdrum was found clinging to the underside of his truck. Anderson shifted in his chair, finally leaning forward, as if to emphasize his denial. "Like I said before, I go hiking out there sometimes. That doesn't mean anything." He was measured but defiant, his tone revealing that he was aware of how damning this conversation could become. The interrogation took a more emotional turn after photographs of the evidence were laid in front of him. The torn denim from the hiking trail, the bracelet Madison had worn, her smiling face printed on the missing posters that had flooded Rathdrum for weeks. Anderson's initial reaction was to look away. "This has nothing to do with me," he muttered, though his voice was noticeably quieter now. His body language followed suit, arms uncrossed and hands now resting stiffly on the table. What had once been defiance began to turn into discomfort. Experienced interrogators know that bridging the emotional distance is sometimes as important as the evidence itself. At this point, the detective switched tactics, focusing on Anderson's background. He asked about his childhood, his quiet tendencies, the frequent moves from one state to another. He didn't frame the questions as accusations. He made them feel conversational, as if he were trying to understand Anderson's perspective. A method called the read technique is often used in cases like this, where open-ended rapport-building questions slowly shift into scenarios that challenge inconsistencies in the suspect's story. The goal is to make denial feel less like an option without escalating aggression or hostility. When the detective slowly began weaving in more direct questions about Madison, Anderson's responses started to falter. By mid-afternoon, Anderson's stoicism had all but faded. His voice quivered slightly when confronted with the new evidence surrounding his truck, the soil analysis, the driver's seat hair samples, and how the timeline aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. When asked directly why multiple witnesses described him and his truck in areas connected to Madison's disappearance, his response was defensive. "People see what they want to see," he snapped. "You're all just trying to make me into someone I'm not." It becoming less of an outright denial and more of a deflection. The breakthrough came with what at first seemed like a small, slip-away detail. A second detective, joining the interrogation, casually reintroduced the recovered bracelet. He didn't accuse Anderson outright, but instead made an observation about how personal it was, how it clearly represented something significant in Madison's life. The detective paused and leaned back in his chair, letting the silence linger. "People don't usually lose things like that," he said quietly, "and they definitely don't trade them for cash unless someone took it from them." That observation hung in the air. Anderson didn't argue this time. The silence stretched on for minutes, broken only by the faint sound of a recorder capturing every passing second. Tears welled up in Anderson's eyes, not falling, but visible enough for the detectives to notice. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The room froze. This was the first indication of responsibility. The next question came carefully. "What didn't you mean, Gerald?" The detective's tone remained calm but steady, designed to draw him out. Anderson responded haltingly, I don't know. I don't know how it got that far." From there, Anderson unraveled in fragments, speaking rapidly at times and trailing off at others. He admitted he had passed Madison on the street that morning, recognizing her from around the neighborhood. He claimed he had been curious, stopping his truck when he saw her walking alone. What started as an attempt to talk, according to him, escalated when Madison became visibly uncomfortable and tried to walk away. Anderson described panicking, though he didn't clarify his exact actions. He claimed that things got out of hand, and that he didn't mean for it to go so far. The detectives didn't interrupt as he continued. Anderson's confession provided critical details about the timeline. He admitted to driving Madison out toward the wooded trails after she got into his truck, though he insisted it wasn't with the intent of harming her. He tried to justify his actions, saying she had agreed to talk things through, but became difficult once they reached the secluded area. His statements grew less coherent as he attempted to justify each decision, but what became obvious was how deliberate his actions had been. He described leaving her in the woods, visibly shaken, and driving into town to collect himself before returning later to clean up the evidence of her presence. Psychological experts explain that suspects often minimize their own actions during confessions, reframing them to reduce their level of perceived guilt. Anderson's confession followed this pattern, almost as if he were trying to convince himself as much as the detectives that he hadn't intended for things to go as they did, but his own words betrayed him. When detectives pressed about the torn jeans and Madison's other belongings found buried in the dirt, Anderson admitted only that he didn't know what else to do. The confession spanned hours, the weight of it settling over the room as Anderson spoke in circles around key moments. Still, it was enough to fill in the gaps in the evidence and align his involvement conclusively with Madison's disappearance. Anderson's tone remained defensive, even as his voice cracked under the strain of each admission. "I didn't hurt her on purpose," he repeated several times. But there was no escaping the fact that his actions, his deliberate choices, had ended Madison's life and shattered a family. For the detectives, it was a grim relief. They had what they needed now. Anderson's confession matched the timeline corroborated by physical evidence and surveillance data, confirming their theory piece by piece. But the most chilling part was what remained unsaid. Even during his confession, Anderson refused to articulate the full truth, leaving lingering questions about his motives and the possibility of other victims. For Karen Graham and her family, the confession brought the beginning of closure, but no relief. Madison's story would remain a painful memory for everyone who had searched tirelessly for answers. Anderson's words, though incomplete and self-serving, were a harsh confirmation of what the evidence had already suggested. And while he had finally spoken the truth, the depth of what he had done was something the town of Rathdrum, and beyond, would struggle to forgive or forget. Madison Graham was the kind of person who left an impression wherever she went. At just 17 years old, she seemed to carry a natural light that others gravitated toward. Her friends, her family, even her teachers all remarked on how her kind heart and unrelenting optimism made her stand out in their small community of Rathdrum. She wasn't someone loud or over the top in the way she approached the world, but rather someone who found joy in simplicity. Whether it was reading in the corner of the school library, walking her rescue cat, Tigger, on a leash, yes, she trained him, or stopping to help a neighbor with their groceries, Madison touched people's lives in quiet but impactful ways. She just had this energy that made you feel safe around her, said her best friend, Jessie Wilkes, during an interview for the local news. Even when you were having the worst day, she could make you laugh without even trying. Madison had a natural gift for connection, something her mother Karen often described as her superpower. She was the eldest of 3 siblings, and in many ways, she took on that role wholeheartedly, helping her younger brothers with homework, watching over them at the park, and breaking up their endless disputes over video games. Madison was like another parent sometimes, Karen said, holding back tears. She had this fire in her, but she was soft too. Gentle. Her dreams reflected that balance of compassion and determination. Madison had wanted to become a veterinarian ever since she was old enough to walk. She filled sketchbooks with drawings of dogs, cats, and even the occasional frog she had caught and released in the schoolyard. By the age of 14, she had convinced a local animal shelter to let her volunteer, despite technically being too young for the role. She'd show up 3 times a week, helping walk the dogs and feed the cats, always going above and beyond what anyone asked her to do. For Madison, it wasn't just about the animals, it was about giving them comfort. Her ambitious nature didn't end with her career hopes. Madison was 3 months into training for a half marathon at the time of her disappearance. Most mornings, she'd lace up her sneakers and head out before the sun rose, running through the quiet streets of her neighborhood and into nearby trails. It was her way of challenging herself, of creating structure and setting goals. In many ways, those runs became a perfect metaphor for Madison's personality, quietly determined, focused, and independent. She never waited for someone else to take the lead. She created her own path. But Madison's life was more than just aspirational goals. She loved music, with a particular soft spot for old-school soul records her mother had played on repeat when she was little. Her friends teased her endlessly for her taste in movies. She had a fondness for cheesy romantic comedies from the 2000s, but it was all part of her charm. She was just real, said her neighbor, Sandra Lutz. "The kind of girl you hope your kids turn out like. Sweet, polite, but with a lot of heart." Madison's world should have been as safe as it appeared. She lived in a community where people looked out for one another, where familiarity bred trust. It's part of the reason her disappearance hit Rathdrum so hard. She was everyone's daughter, sister, or friend. It felt personal. But looking back at the days leading up to her tragic fate, investigators couldn't ignore the intersecting threads that made her vulnerable. Her independence was one of her most admirable traits, but it also played a part in what would become a fateful encounter. While the details of how Madison first crossed paths with Gerald Anderson remain fuzzy, investigators pieced together a likely scenario based on fragments of his confession and witness statements. Anderson had only lived in Rathdrum for a short time before the crime, renting a house in a quiet neighborhood not far from Madison's family home. Madison's routine runs regularly took her past that area, though she never spoke of noticing anything unusual. It wasn't uncommon for her to smile or wave politely at people she passed on the street, especially if she recognized them from around town. While investigators believe her interaction with Anderson that morning may have been brief, it happened at the perfect intersection of opportunity and isolation. The street was sparsely populated, with long stretches where neighbors' houses were separated by dense woods. One particular morning stood out to a neighbor who later testified. They recalled seeing Anderson leaning against his truck, smoking, as Madison jogged past. Though they didn't think much of it at the time, Anderson was new to the area, and his presence wasn't immediately suspicious. It stuck in their mind after Madison vanished. Whether this was the first or only time Anderson had noticed her is unclear, but his passing comment during interrogation, "I'd seen her before. She seemed nice," hinted he may have been watching longer than anyone realized. In many victimology studies, crimes like Madison's often highlight a troubling dynamic, predators exploiting not just moments of opportunity, but also traits like kindness and openness. Victims in similar cases are often described as trusting, approachable, or simply going about a routine that made them visible to the wrong person. This overlap between routine and randomness is what makes cases like Madison's so devastating. She wasn't reckless or careless in her habits. She was a teenage girl following her usual path, something no one should ever fear doing in their own neighborhood. One moment in particular stood out to Karen when reflecting on those days. It was a seemingly small event, but it now haunted her. A few weeks before her disappearance, Madison had run into a man at the local convenience store as she grabbed a sports drink after a morning jog. When she came home, she casually mentioned someone at the counter, commenting on how motivated she must be to run so early. Karen remembered feeling a pang of protectiveness then, but Madison brushed it off as a friendly encounter. Whether or not this man had been Anderson, investigators couldn't confirm. But for Karen, the memory carried a weight she couldn't let go of, one brief interaction that, in hindsight, felt like a warning she hadn't been able to see at the time. Madison's openness wasn't a weakness, it was her strength. And yet, in the end, it was someone else's exploitation of that openness that brought such unimaginable pain to her family. Anderson's motive, revealed through his fragmented confession, painted a picture of someone who had likely been driven by obsession, opportunity, and control. He admitted to wanting just to talk when he first approached Madison that morning, but his own actions betrayed something darker. Detectives saw through the passive framing in his statements, recognizing the hallmarks of someone who had methodically manipulated the situation to his advantage. Anderson didn't target Madison because she was reckless or because of anything she did. It was simply because she was there, and he had the wrong intentions from the start. Understanding Madison's story offers a glimpse into the deeper tragedy of her loss. She wasn't just a victim of a crime, she was a sister who made pancakes for her brothers on Sunday mornings when Karen worked an extra shift. She was a friend who stayed up late, reviewing Jesse's college application essays, even though Madison's own were still unfinished. She was the kind of daughter who left sticky notes on the bathroom mirror for her mum. "Have a great day. Love you." Her life was more than the few days the nation spent focusing on her disappearance. It was years of small, stitched-together moments that made her who she was. And when Gerald Anderson stole that life, it wasn't just the Graham family he devastated, it was the entire community. Families began taking extra precautions, suddenly doubting the safety that Rathdrum had always promised. Joggers started running in groups or avoiding secluded trails altogether. For Karen, Madison's absence meant mourning the milestones she'd never get to see her daughter achieve. She had so many plans, Karen shared in an interview months later. College, vet school, getting a little house with a big yard so she could adopt all the dogs she wanted. None of us get to see that now. Perhaps the hardest reality to face is how random it all seemed. Madison wasn't a person who lived life carelessly. She was cautious, thoughtful, and surrounded by people who loved her deeply. Yet, despite all that, she became someone else's twisted fixation, a target chosen in a moment she could have never foreseen. It's in understanding her story that we grasp the senselessness of her loss and the depth of the impact her life had on those around her. Madison Graham's story wasn't about the end of her life, but the promise it held before it was cut short. Looking at the person she was reminds us of why this crime shook her community to its core. The town of Rathdrum, mourning one of its brightest lights, realized their sense of safety might never fully return. What remained, though, was a determination to seek justice, not just for Madison, but for the future of the small town that had once felt so untouchable. As the court case loomed, so did the question of how Rathdrum would come to terms with the aftermath of such a profound tragedy. Gerald Anderson's trial began nearly a year after Madison Graham's disappearance, but the emotional weight of the case had not diminished for her family or the community of Rathdrum. The courtroom was packed on the first day, rows filled with family members, reporters, and local residents who had followed every step of the investigation. For many, this wasn't just about justice, it was about finding closure for everything the town had lost. Madison's parents, Karen and Joe, were present every day of the proceedings, often clutching tissues or leaning on one another for support as the prosecution laid out the details of their daughter's final hours. The case presented by the state was strong. Prosecutors relied on the array of physical evidence linking Anderson to the crime, including forensic analysis of the soil on his truck, DNA from the hair fibers found in his vehicle, and the torn pieces of Madison's clothing recovered on the trail. The digital trail also proved vital in shaping the narrative. Phone records tied Anderson to the critical locations, while surveillance footage of his distinctive truck cemented his presence near the gas station where Madison's phone had been discarded. But it was Anderson's confession that took center stage. Prosecutors played clips from the interrogation, letting the jury hear his hesitant admissions. While Anderson had never explicitly admitted to harming Madison, his statements about her getting into his truck willingly and things getting out of hand painted a chilling portrait of what had happened that morning. The defense, however, pushed back. They attempted to frame Anderson's confession as coerced, painting him as a man overwhelmed by police pressure, desperate to tell them what they wanted to hear. They poked holes in the timeline and tried to argue that the recovered evidence had been circumstantial, but it was clear the weight of the prosecution's case was difficult to counter. For Madison's parents, sitting through the trial was described as gut-wrenching. Each day brought new details or evidence that forced them to relive their daughter's final moments. Hearing them discuss her like she was just evidence, it broke my heart, Karen said in an interview shortly after the trial ended. But I knew we had to be there, for her. She deserved that. At one point, Madison's best friend Jessie took the stand, describing Madison's bright spirit and quiet determination in a statement filled with both love and wrenching sorrow. She was my person, Jessie told the court. The one I always went to when I didn't know what to do. And I'll never get to hear her voice again. The testimony and evidence took weeks to present, but the jury reached a unanimous verdict in just 8 hours of deliberation. Anderson was found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping, sentences that came with life in prison without the possibility of parole. Madison's family wept openly as the verdict was read, her younger brothers clutching their mother tightly. Anderson showed little emotion, barely reacting as the judge handed down the sentence. For Rathdrum, the decision offered a sense of justice, but not relief. As Madison's uncle later told a reporter, justice is important, but it doesn't take away the pain. The aftermath of the trial rippled far beyond the courtroom. For weeks, the town of Rathdrum could barely settle into its old rhythm. Parents became more protective, schools held safety assemblies, and community groups began advocating for improved street surveillance and lighting in more remote areas. The loss of Madison, a figure so emblematic of everything the community valued, youth, kindness, hope, left an absence that was hard to ignore. Conversations about the case dominated the aisles of local grocery stores, the bar stools at the diner, and the queues during Sunday service. People weren't just grieving, they were questioning. How had something like this happened here? Karen and Joe threw themselves into advocacy, determined to ensure their daughter's story would leave behind more than grief. They started a foundation in Madison's name, dedicated to supporting legislation that improved the way missing person cases were handled in rural towns. Their primary focus was on early response times, something experts have highlighted as a critical factor but often lacking in small police departments. In Madison's case, those early hours, while vital, had been bogged down by the assumption that she might have been out with friends or simply late checking in. A 2020 report from the National Criminal Justice Reference Service highlighted that missing person cases in rural areas face delays in over 30% of investigations, often due to limited resources or a lack of urgency. It was this issue that the Grahams hoped to address through their newfound advocacy, although Karen admitted the effort often felt bittersweet. Every time I see her name on a poster or hear it at an event, it breaks me a little. But if even one family gets their child back because of her, it's worth it, she told a local journalist. Prosecutors called Anderson's conviction ironclad. But the truth was that Madison's case left unanswered questions that lingered, even as the legal chapter closed. Anderson's confession had been murky, with major gaps about his intentions and the exact details of Madison's final moments. Forensic experts could confirm she had been in his truck and later abandoned at the wooded trails. But a clear explanation from Anderson about why he had targeted her, what had gone through his mind that morning, was never provided. These silences frustrated not just investigators but also Madison's family. "We'll never know everything," Karen admitted. "And that, more than anything, keeps me up at night." Beyond Madison's case, Anderson's movements across state lines raised troubling questions about what else he might have been involved in. As soon as his name entered national databases, investigators in Montana and Washington reopened unsolved cases involving missing women that matched similar patterns. In Montana, an unidentified person's remains were re-examined after Anderson's truck had been placed near the location around the time they went missing. Another case in Oregon saw local detectives trying to match DNA evidence recovered from a wooded area to Anderson to establish more concrete ties. None of these investigations resulted in charges against Anderson, at least not yet, but the possibilities cast a long shadow over his past. Many wondered if Madison's wasn't the only life he had derailed. The psychological toll on Madison's family was profound and far-reaching. Studies on families affected by violent crime, like those published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, suggest that unresolved questions can deepen the trauma long after convictions are secured. These studies also highlight how community-wide losses, like Madison's, create ripple effects in small towns, where grief and anxiety spread quickly due to the close-knit nature of these places. In Rathdrum, counsellors reported an uptick in clients following the case, many of them teenagers grappling with the realization that their routines and sense of safety had been irrevocably changed. "Madison was one of us," said her high school principal in a press statement. "She wasn't just one person's loss, she was everyone's." Madison's story became a reminder of just how fragile safety can feel, even in places like Rathdrum, so often insulated from the turmoil of larger towns and cities. For some residents, this realization brought a rise in vigilance and caution. For others, it sparked frustration, a longing to go back to how things were before Anderson arrived in their community. But one sentiment remained universal. Madison Graham deserved better than the fate that found her. Lingering questions about Anderson's other possible crimes only deepened the wounds left behind. Was he, as prosecutors suggested, a predator who had spent years operating under the cover of small-town anonymity, leaving few traces behind? Or had Madison's encounter been an isolated act fueled by impulsive, dangerous curiosity? These were the kinds of questions that haunted those closest to the case, but answers seemed just out of reach. Detectives pledged to continue working, revisiting old clues in other states tied to Anderson's long and transient past. Even years later, Rathdrum felt the imprint of Madison's loss. A memorial bench now sits near the town library, engraved with her favorite quote, "Do small things with great love." It's a quiet gesture, one that reflects the kind of person Madison was, and the kind of person her family refuses to let be forgotten. As Karen put it during the dedication ceremony, "This is a scar that won't disappear, but we can choose what to do with the pain." For her, that choice meant steering the memory of her daughter into something meaningful, something lasting. The case left behind more than just scars. It became a window into the fragility of trust and the resilience of small communities in the face of something unthinkable. The ripples may never fully fade, but they carry with them a message of vigilance, advocacy, and love, a reflection of Madison's quiet strength. Madison Graham's story is a reminder of how lives can change in an instant, even in places that feel safe. Her disappearance shattered a community's sense of security, revealing the cracks in the systems meant to protect us. While her family channeled their grief into action, advocating for change, questions remain about Gerald Anderson's past and the true extent of his actions. This case shows how small threads can lead to justice, but it also reflects the fragility of what we often take for granted. What can we do, as individuals, to ensure voices like Madison's are never silenced again?